Hello there and welcome to Secretum Histories. Tonight we're easing into a subject that sits quietly beneath some of the heaviest stone ever placed by human hands. A subject that does not announce itself with spectacle or drama, but waits patiently under layers of earth, weight and time. Before we go any further, settle in. Lower the lights if you can. Let the room become still. If you find this calm and grounding, you're welcome to like the video and subscribe, but only if it genuinely adds something peaceful to your evening. This channel exists for slow listening, for thoughtful drifting, and for stories that don't rush toward conclusions. What we're exploring tonight is not the familiar image of gods descending from the sky, not shining beings arriving in thunder and fire, and not the modern obsession with what might have come down from above. Instead, we're turning our attention downward, toward foundations, toward what is buried, sealed, pressed into the ground beneath structures so massive they appear eternal. Across the ancient world, the greatest monuments were not built at random locations. They were placed deliberately, repeatedly, and with remarkable consistency over places already considered powerful, dangerous, or significant long before stone was ever stacked upon stone. The idea that monuments exist only to be seen is a modern assumption. In the ancient world, visibility was often secondary. What mattered just as much, and sometimes more, was what lay beneath. The ground itself carried meaning. It held memory. It was believed to store forces that could not be left exposed. And when ancient builders chose to erect monuments of extraordinary weight, scale, and permanence, they were not always marking something above ground. In many cases, they were sealing something below. Sumerian texts do not begin their stories with mountains, towers, or heavens. They begin with waters beneath the earth, with depths that existed before order, with spaces that were not meant to be entered casually. In these records, power is repeatedly associated with what is contained, confined, and pressed down rather than what is elevated. The gods most closely associated with knowledge, judgment, and fate are not described as living in the sky alone, but as having authority over what lies below the surface of the world, beneath soil, beneath stone, beneath the places where humans eventually built. When later cultures inherited these locations, they often did not fully understand why those sites were chosen in the first place. What they inherited was the instruction that the ground was sacred, dangerous, or untouchable. And so they did what humans have always done when confronted with something powerful and poorly understood. They built over it. They covered it. They marked it with weight and ritual. They transformed containment into reverence. Across Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Levant, Mesoamerica, and parts of Asia, the same pattern appears again and again. Massive monuments placed atop earlier foundations, temples built over sealed chambers, platforms raised over voids. In many cases, excavation stops just short of reaching what lies below, not because ancient builders lacked the skill, but because later generations treated those depths with caution. Silence replaces explanation. Records grow vague. Language shifts from description to ritual. The Sumerians themselves spoke of certain places where the boundary between worlds was thin, where the waters of the Abzu pressed close to the surface, where knowledge flowed upward, but danger followed it. These places were not meant for ordinary movement. They were stabilized, weighted, covered. The solution was not to destroy what lay beneath, but to contain it permanently. Stone was not decoration. Stone was pressure. Stone was restraint. This approach stands in sharp contrast to the modern idea that ancient monuments were built to glorify gods who arrived from the stars. The earliest texts do not describe beings eager to be seen or worshipped through towering displays. They describe beings concerned with balance, order, and control. Knowledge was not something to scatter freely. It was something to regulate, and when something could not be removed, it was sealed. Consider the consistent emphasis on foundations in ancient inscriptions, not the walls, not the upper chambers. The foundation deposits received the most ritual attention. Objects placed beneath structures were not offerings meant to be retrieved. They were markers of intent, statements that something had been closed, bounded, or fixed in place. The act of building was less about reaching upward and more about pressing downward with sufficient force to prevent movement. Later, myth transforms these acts into symbolic stories. The underworld becomes a realm of the dead rather than a physical domain. Judgment becomes moral rather than administrative. What was once described as containment becomes reinterpreted as punishment or mythic descent. But the physical pattern remains unchanged. Heavy stone above, restricted access below, silence in the texts where explanation would otherwise appear. When archaeologists encounter these sites, they often note how incomplete the exploration feels. Chambers that lead nowhere, shafts that stop abruptly, corridors intentionally blocked. The language used is cautious. Practical explanations are offered, but rarely satisfying. Structural necessity does not fully explain why access points were sealed so deliberately, or why certain spaces were left empty but inaccessible. The monuments feel less like houses or temples and more like lids. Sumerian cosmology does not separate the idea of space from function. The underworld is not merely where the dead go. It is where decisions are finalized, where decrees are fixed, where boundaries are enforced. The Anunnaki, in their earliest and most consistent descriptions, are not travellers or creators in the popular sense. They are determiners, judges. They are associated with sealed outcomes rather than open processes. Their domain aligns naturally with places that are closed, weighted, and final. This reframes the role of monumental architecture entirely. Rather than serving as platforms for divine arrival, these structures may have served as anchors, points of pressure, physical assurances that what lay beneath would remain where it was. Over time, the original reason faded, but the instruction remained. Build here. Do not dig deeper. Maintain the structure. Repeat the rituals. Preserve the boundary. The result is a world scattered with immense stone constructions that dominate landscapes while concealing very little about their original purpose. The upper portions change with culture and time. Temples become churches. Pyramids become symbols. Ziggurats erode into hills. But the ground beneath them remains undisturbed, guarded by tradition, law, and unease. There is no urgency in the ancient texts to explain these things clearly. That absence itself carries meaning. What required sealing did not require advertisement. The danger was not curiosity. The danger was disturbance. Stability was achieved through mass, repetition, and silence. As the night continues, this pattern will become clearer, not through speculation, but through careful alignment of text, architecture, and behaviour. What ancient people did repeatedly tells a quieter story than what later myths claimed, and that story begins not in the sky, but beneath our feet, where stone presses down on memory, and meaning is held in place by weight rather than words. Across the ancient world, the placement of monuments followed a logic that modern maps and tourist guides rarely capture. These structures were not positioned for visibility alone, nor were they selected simply because the terrain was convenient or impressive. Long before stone was raised into recognizable shapes, long before builders planned walls, steps, or chambers, the ground itself was chosen first. The location mattered more than the structure. In many cases, the structure existed because of the ground, not the other way around. What modern language calls sacred ground was not originally sacred in a sentimental or symbolic sense. It was not chosen because it was beautiful, elevated, or inspiring. Sacred ground, in the oldest traditions, was ground that demanded caution, ground that carried memory, ground that was already marked by presence, by event, or by something that predated human construction entirely. These places were not neutral. They were active in the world view of the people who lived near them, and that activity required management. In Sumerian tradition, the land itself was layered. What humans saw and used daily was only the uppermost surface of a deeper structure. Beneath fields, cities, and rivers existed other domains, other spaces with their own rules and inhabitants. The Abzu, the subterranean waters, were not imagined as distant or abstract. They were immediate. They pressed upward. Springs, wells, and floods were not accidents. They were expressions of what lay below. Where these forces came close to the surface, the ground was considered unstable in more than a physical sense. These locations became focal points, not because people wanted to gather there freely, but because they needed to define boundaries, to say here and no further. The act of building on such ground was an act of containment. Weight was applied deliberately. Stone was chosen because it endured, because it resisted movement, because it could hold something down for generations without needing explanation. The monument was not the message. The monument was the mechanism. This pattern appears first in the earliest cities of southern Mesopotamia. Eridu, widely regarded by the Sumerians themselves as the first city, was not founded randomly on the plain. It sat near the edge of the ancient shoreline, close to where fresh water met salt, near the imagined boundary between the world of humans and the deeper cosmic waters. Enki's temple there was not simply a place of worship. It was understood to be built above the Abzu itself. The temple marked a point of contact, but also a point of restraint. Rituals acknowledged what was beneath without inviting it upward. As cities grew, this logic repeated. Temples rose where the ground was already considered powerful or dangerous. Ziggurats were constructed not merely to elevate worshippers, but to stabilize locations where forces were believed to converge. The massive platforms did not just lift buildings into the sky. They pressed downward. Their foundations extended deep, sometimes deeper than the visible structure suggested, anchoring the site into the earth. When later civilizations encountered these same locations, they inherited the warning without always understanding its origin. The ground was marked, the stories were incomplete, but the instruction remained. Build here, maintain the structure, do not disturb what lies below. Over time, reverence replaced restraint in the language used to describe these sites. Sacredness became aesthetic rather than functional, but the behavior remained consistent. Egypt offers a parallel example. The Giza Plateau was not selected simply because it offered a commanding view or stable bedrock. Long before the pyramids were constructed, the area was already associated with older beliefs about the underworld and the horizon, the place where the sun transitioned between worlds. The plateau sat above natural cavities, fissures, and geological features that ancient builders were aware of. The choice to place enormous stone structures there transformed the landscape into something fixed, immovable, and sealed. The pyramids themselves, often interpreted as tombs or symbolic mountains, functioned physically as enormous weights. Their mass compressed the ground beneath them. Their internal passages were narrow, controlled, and limited. Access was not encouraged. It was restricted, rerouted, or blocked entirely. Later dynasties preserved the external form while often avoiding deep excavation beneath the original structures. The pattern is subtle but consistent. The deeper one looks, the more resistance appears. In the Levant, the same logic governs the placement of ancient sanctuaries and later monumental complexes. Jerusalem, for example, was not founded as a neutral city that later acquired sacred status. Its bedrock, caves, and subterranean spaces were already significant in earlier traditions. When the Temple Mount was developed, layers of construction accumulated over time, each reinforcing the weight and permanence of what lay beneath. The most restricted spaces were not the highest towers, but the deepest chambers. Across the ocean, in Mesoamerica, monumental architecture follows the same principle. Pyramids and platforms were often built atop earlier structures, which themselves were built over natural caves or voids. These caves were not treated as ordinary geological features. They were entrances to other realms, sources of water, places of emergence. Rather than leaving them exposed, builders covered them, incorporated them, or sealed them beneath successive layers of stone. What connects these cultures is not shared technology or direct contact, but a shared response to certain kinds of places. Where the ground suggested instability, presence, or power, humans responded with mass and structure. The greater the perceived significance of what lay beneath, the greater the effort to stabilize it. The monument became a visible signal that the site was controlled, ordered, and no longer subject to unpredictable interaction. Sumerian texts support this interpretation through what they emphasize and what they omit. They describe gods assigning domains, fixing boundaries, and determining fates. They describe spaces that must not be crossed without permission. They describe underworld gates, seals, and judges. They do not describe casual movement between realms. Access is regulated. Entry requires authorization. Certain places are final. When later texts describe temples or cities as being chosen, that choice is rarely explained in detail. The explanation was not necessary for the intended audience. The audience already knew that certain locations were marked long before the current structure existed. The act of building was a continuation of an older agreement, not a new declaration. Archaeological evidence reinforces this view. In many monumental sites, the earliest layers are the least accessible. The deeper levels show signs of intentional closure rather than abandonment. Materials used to block passages are often heavier and more permanent than what would be required for simple construction convenience. In some cases, objects placed beneath foundations appear to serve no decorative or ritual purpose that involved retrieval. They were not offerings meant to be seen again. They were markers of closure. This behaviour suggests that what mattered was not interaction, but prevention. The ancient world was not obsessed with discovery. It was obsessed with order. Knowledge was valuable, but only when controlled. Power was acknowledged, but only when bounded. Sacred ground was not a place to explore freely. It was a place to respect by keeping it sealed. As centuries passed, myths softened these ideas. What was once a physical boundary became a moral one. What was once a practical act of containment became a story about divine favour or punishment. But the stones remained. The weight remained. The locations did not change. Even today, modern excavation often halts at these sites not solely because of technical difficulty, but because of inherited hesitation. Legal restrictions, religious sensitivity, and cultural unease converge. The ground is still treated as exceptional, still protected, still avoided. The behaviour persists even when the original rationale has been forgotten. This continuity across time suggests that the placement of the world's greatest monuments was never arbitrary. These structures sit on sacred ground because the ground demanded it. Because something about those places required attention, stabilisation, and long-term management. The monument was not the origin of sacredness. It was the response to it. And once that response was enacted, once stone pressed down on earth, and silence replaced explanation, the purpose no longer needed to be stated. The structure itself became the reminder. The ground was marked, the boundary held, and the story continued forward, carried not by words, but by weight. The earliest written texts humanity ever produced do not begin by looking upward. They do not open with the sky, with stars, or with distant realms above the clouds. They begin beneath the surface of the world. They begin with what lies below. This is not an interpretive choice imposed by later readers. It is a structural fact of the texts themselves. When the first scribes pressed wedge-shaped marks into clay, recording what their cultures believed about existence, origin, and order, their attention consistently moved downward before it ever moved up. In Sumerian cosmology, the deepest layer of reality is not heaven but the Abzu. This was not a poetic metaphor for mystery. It was understood as a real, foundational domain, a vast subterranean expanse of fresh water that existed before land, before sky, before separation, before time had direction. The Abzu was not created. It was already there. Everything else emerged after. This placement alone tells us something essential about how the earliest thinkers understood power. Power did not descend into the world. Power emerged from below it. The Abzu was described as a place of origin, but also of containment. It was not chaotic in the sense of disorder. It was dangerous because it was undifferentiated. It held potential without boundaries. In the Sumerian worldview, order was something imposed upon this depth, not something inherent to it. The act of creation did not eliminate the Abzu. It constrained it. Land was raised above it. Foundations were set against it. Boundaries were drawn so that what lay beneath would remain beneath. The god most closely associated with wisdom, creation, and foresight, Enki, does not rule from the sky in these earliest accounts. He dwells in the Abzu. His home is below the earth, not above it. This detail is often overlooked or softened in later retellings, but it is explicit in the oldest sources. Enki's intelligence, his ability to solve problems and avert disasters, comes from his proximity to the deepest layer of existence. Knowledge flows upward from depth. It does not rain down from the heavens. This pattern repeats across the earliest texts. When decisions of fate are made, they are finalized in the underworld. When boundaries are enforced, they are enforced below. The realm beneath the earth is where outcomes are fixed, not debated. Heaven may host authority, but finality belongs to what lies beneath. This is why the deities associated with judgment, destiny, and irreversible decrees are consistently linked to subterranean domains. The Anunnaki themselves, in their earliest descriptions, are not sky beings. They are not travellers. They are not watchers hovering above humanity. They are a collective tied to the underworld, to the determination of fate, to what happens after actions are complete. Their presence is felt where movement stops, where transitions end, where seals are placed. This association is not symbolic in the modern sense. It reflects a worldview where the deepest layer of reality carries the greatest weight. Early hymns and god lists reinforce this emphasis. They carefully assign domains, and those domains are vertical in structure. Sky, earth, and below earth are not equal. They are sequential. What lies below supports what lies above. The sky does not exist independently. It is suspended, held in place by separation from the earth, and the earth itself rests on waters that were never removed, only restrained. This restraint is a recurring theme. The texts speak of gates, doors, and bolts in relation to the underworld. These are not poetic flourishes. They are functional descriptions. The underworld is not a place one wanders into accidentally. It is accessed through controlled points. Entry requires permission. Exit is rare and regulated. The emphasis is not on exploration, but on restriction. Even when later texts describe ascents to heaven, these journeys are exceptional and temporary. Descents, by contrast, carry permanence. What goes down is changed. What goes down is subject to judgment. This asymmetry matters. It tells us that the earliest writers did not see the world as oriented toward the sky. They saw it as anchored in depth. When creation itself is described, it begins with waters beneath, not with light above. Separation occurs vertically, but the force comes from below pushing upward, and from above being lifted away. The act that creates space for life is not descent but division, and division requires something to be pressed down and something to be held up. Weight and tension are implied from the very beginning. This understanding shaped how early civilizations interacted with their environment. Wells were not just sources of water, they were points of connection. Digging was an act that required ritual. Springs were not neutral features, They were openings. Floods were not accidents. They were reminders of what lay beneath pressing upward when boundaries failed. The earliest legal texts mirror this cosmology. Laws are not framed as ideals descending from a perfect realm. They are framed as constraints imposed to prevent disorder. Punishments often involve burial, confinement, or exclusion from the surface world. Social order is maintained by controlling movement, especially downward movement into spaces associated with finality. When temples are described in early inscriptions, their foundations receive more attention than their upper structures. Foundation rituals are elaborate. Objects placed beneath buildings are named and recorded. These objects are not meant to be recovered. They are not offerings in the later sense. They are markers, statements that a boundary has been set and will be maintained. The language used in these rituals is precise. The goal is stability. The foundation is fixed. The ground is secured. The building is made firm. These phrases are repeated not because they are decorative, but because they express the core purpose of construction. A building that does not stabilize the ground beneath it has failed in its primary task. As writing spread and cultures evolved, this emphasis did not disappear. It was reinterpreted. Sky gods became more prominent in later periods, especially as political authority centralized and rulers sought heavenly legitimacy. But even then, the deepest rituals remained focused on the ground. Burials, foundation deposits, sealed chambers, and restricted spaces continue to receive the greatest care. The persistence of these practices suggests that the earliest understanding of reality left a deep imprint. Even when the language shifted, the behavior remained. Humans continued to act as if what lay beneath required management, as if depth carried a kind of authority that height did not replace. This perspective challenges modern assumptions. Today, significance is often associated with elevation. Skyscrapers, towers, and satellites define power. In the ancient world, power was associated with depth, with what could not be seen, with what had to be held in place. The earliest texts are quiet about the sky because the sky was not where the greatest risk lay. The risk was below, beneath the feet of cities, beneath temples, beneath monuments. The danger was not that something would arrive from above, but that something already present might re-emerge if boundaries failed. This is why so much effort was devoted to containment rather than discovery. Why silence follows construction. Why explanations grow sparse once foundations are laid. The job was done. The ground was secured. There was no need to elaborate further. Understanding this shift in perspective changes how ancient monuments are read. They stop being messages aimed at the heavens and start looking like responses to the earth. They appear less as declarations and more as assurances. Assurances that what lay below would remain where it was. And once that assurance was established, once weight pressed down and order held, the texts moved on. Not upward, forward. Carrying the assumption that the deepest layer of reality was no longer something to confront directly, but something to live above, carefully, generation after generation. Long before stone walls rose into the air, before terraces, columns, or steps took recognizable form, ancient builders were already at work beneath the surface. What we see today when we stand before the great monuments of the ancient world is only the final layer of a much older process. The visible structure came last. The foundation came first. And in many cases that foundation existed generations, even centuries, before the monument that now defines the site. This sequence is not accidental, nor is it simply a matter of engineering convenience. In the ancient world, foundations were not treated as technical necessities alone. They were acts of intention. They marked decisions that could not easily be undone. Once a foundation was placed, the site was claimed, stabilized, and in a sense, closed. Everything that followed was built in response to what had already been fixed into the ground. In the earliest Mesopotamian cities, the process of building began with careful preparation of the earth. The ground was tested, cleared, levelled, and ritually addressed before any major structure was allowed to rise. Texts and archaeological layers show repeated phases where platforms were laid down, reinforced, and left exposed for long periods before further construction occurred. These platforms were not temporary. They were permanent features meant to define the relationship between the surface world and whatever lay beneath it. At sites like Eridu, Uruk, and Ur, excavations reveal stacked foundations beneath later temples. Each generation built upon the previous one, but rarely disturbed the deepest layers. When older foundations were encountered, they were respected, incorporated, and reinforced rather than removed. This suggests that the earliest builders were not improvising. They were responding to something already present, something that required continuity rather than replacement. The act of placing a foundation carried meaning beyond structural stability. Foundation deposits, objects intentionally buried beneath corners, walls, or central points, were not decorative offerings. They were records of closure. Inscriptions placed out of sight named kings, gods, and intentions, not for human viewers, but for permanence. These texts were never meant to be read again. Their purpose was fulfilled the moment they were sealed beneath stone. This behaviour points to a world view in which the most important part of a structure was the part no one would see. The foundation was where the real work happened. The visible building was a continuation, not the origin. Once the ground was addressed properly, once it was stabilised and marked, the rest of the structure could unfold over time without altering the original decision. In many cases, there is clear evidence that foundations were laid long before the monumental phases we recognise today. In Egypt, for example, the Giza Plateau shows signs of earlier preparation that predates the Great Pyramid itself. The levelling of bedrock, the cutting of channels, and the shaping of the ground occurred before the pyramid's design was finalised. These preparatory acts were not incidental. They established the site as fixed, chosen, and non-negotiable. The same pattern appears in Mesopotamian ziggurats. The earliest levels often consist of massive mud brick platforms that supported nothing more than a modest shrine or even remained unused for extended periods. Only later were these platforms expanded upward into towering structures. The foundation determined the future of the site long before its final form was imagined. This sequence challenges the idea that ancient builders conceived monuments fully formed in their minds and then executed them from top to bottom. Instead, the evidence suggests a more cautious approach. The ground was addressed first, its behaviour was observed, its stability was tested, its significance was acknowledged. Only then did builders commit to adding visible structures. The language of ancient inscriptions reflects this priority. Kings boast not first of walls or temples, but of foundations they made firm or set in place. They emphasize depth, solidity, and endurance. The success of a building was measured not by how high it rose, but by how securely it rested. A structure that failed at the foundation level was considered a failure regardless of its appearance. This emphasis becomes even clearer when we consider sites that were rebuilt repeatedly. In cities that experienced destruction from floods, invasions, or abandonment, new structures were often erected atop the remains of old ones without clearing them away. Debris was levelled, foundations were reinforced, and construction continued upward. The accumulated weight increased with each phase, further stabilising the site. This practice had the effect of sealing earlier layers ever more deeply. What began as a modest foundation eventually became buried beneath meters of construction. Over time, the original ground surface disappeared entirely, replaced by an artificial elevation composed of compressed history. Tells and mounds across the Near East are the result of this process. But within this accumulation, the earliest foundations remain untouched. The decision not to excavate downward when rebuilding is telling. From a purely practical standpoint, clearing old foundations might have been easier in some cases, yet builders consistently chose to build over rather than dig down. This suggests a reluctance to disturb what had already been fixed into place. The foundation was treated as final, even when everything above it changed. In religious contexts, this finality carried added weight. Temples were not simply houses for gods. They were points of contact, but also points of control. The foundation defined the terms of that contact. Once set, those terms were not to be renegotiated casually. Renovations addressed walls, roofs, and decorations, but rarely altered the deepest levels. This pattern extends beyond Mesopotamia. In Egypt, later temples were often built atop earlier sacred precincts. At Karnak, for instance, successive phases of construction expanded the complex outward and upward, while the core areas remained anchored to ancient foundations. Builders respected the orientation, placement, and depth of earlier work, even as styles and dynasties changed. In Mesoamerica, pyramids were frequently constructed over earlier pyramids, which themselves covered earlier structures or caves. Each layer added mass and permanence without reopening the original space. The foundation became increasingly inaccessible, buried beneath centuries of ritual reinforcement. These repeated acts of covering suggest that the foundation served a purpose that did not expire. Whatever was being addressed by the initial placement did not diminish with time. If anything, it required ongoing reinforcement. Each new layer reaffirmed the original decision to keep something stabilized and contained. The absence of detailed explanations in the texts about why specific foundations were placed is consistent with this interpretation. The reason did not need to be restated. It was assumed knowledge within the culture. Later generations followed inherited practices without requiring full understanding. The instruction was clear enough. Build here. Do not dig deeper. Archaeological anomalies support this view. In some monumental sites, foundation levels include chambers, voids, or features that appear deliberately unfinished or inaccessible. These are not practical storage spaces or forgotten construction phases. They are intentional absences, spaces defined by their closure rather than their use. The materials chosen for foundations also matter. Builders selected stone, compacted earth, and materials resistant to water and movement. In flood-prone regions, foundations were elevated and reinforced far beyond what would be necessary for ordinary buildings. This extra effort suggests concern not just with supporting weight above, but with resisting pressure from below. Flood myths, so prominent in early texts, reinforce this concern. The danger was not rain alone, but the failure of boundaries. When waters rose, the world reverted toward an earlier state. Foundations were the defense against that regression. They held the line between order and collapse. Over time, as monuments became symbols of power and identity, the original function of foundations receded from conscious awareness. People saw temples and pyramids as representations of divine favor or royal authority. But the behavior surrounding foundations did not change. They remained untouched, respected, and rarely altered. Even today, modern construction around ancient sites often avoids deep excavation, not only because of preservation laws, but because of an inherited sense that certain depths should not be disturbed. This hesitation echoes ancient caution, carried forward without explicit explanation. The visible structures we admire today are therefore only the surface expression of a much older decision. The real monument begins underground, where the first builders made their choice. They addressed the ground, fixed it, and committed future generations to honouring that choice, whether they fully understood it or not. Once that commitment was made, everything else followed. Walls rose, shrines expanded, cities grew, empires fell. But the foundation remained, doing its quiet work, holding something in place, ensuring stability through weight and continuity. Understanding this reverses the usual perspective. Instead of seeing foundations as supports for monuments, we begin to see monuments as covers for foundations. The structure above is not the cause, it is the consequence. And beneath every great monument lies a decision that was made before anyone knew what the finished structure would look like. That decision shaped centuries of building without ever needing to be spoken aloud again. when the earlier Sumerian records are read carefully, without importing later expectations or modern assumptions, a consistent emphasis becomes impossible to ignore. The language does not rise upward, it sinks. Power, authority, origin, and finality are described not in terms of elevation, but in terms of depth. This is not an accident of poetry or a limitation of early imagination. It reflects a worldview in which height was secondary and depth was decisive. In Sumerian thought, height did not equal supremacy. The sky existed, certainly, and it mattered. But it was not the ultimate source of order. The sky was separated, lifted, held in place. What mattered more was what existed before that separation, and what remained beneath it afterward. The records make clear that the deepest layer of existence was older, more enduring, and more fundamental than anything above it. This is why the earliest creation narratives begin with water beneath the earth, rather than light above it. Namu, the primordial waters, is not described as hovering over the world. She is the world before the world exists. From her depth, everything else emerges. The heavens are not creators. They are products of division. They are outcomes, not origins. The act that creates space for life in Sumerian cosmology is not ascent, but separation. Heaven is pulled away from earth. Air is formed between them. This action introduces structure, but it does not eliminate what lies beneath. The waters remain. The depth persists. Creation is not replacement. It is containment. This containment requires constant reinforcement. Sumerian texts repeatedly describe the world as something that must be maintained. Order does not sustain itself automatically. It is upheld against pressure from below. Floods, eruptions, and collapses are not random disasters. They are signs that boundaries have weakened. When the texts describe catastrophe, they describe it as a return toward an earlier state, a loosening of what had been held down. This framing naturally elevates depth over height in importance. Height can fall, depth endures, a tower can collapse, a wall can erode, but what lies beneath remains present even when forgotten. The Sumerians understood this intuitively through their environment. They lived on flat alluvial plains where the ground itself was unstable, where water lurked just beneath the surface, where digging almost anywhere produced seepage. Depth was not abstract, it was immediate. The Absu, the subterranean waters, were not imagined as distant or unreachable. They were encountered daily through wells, springs, and floods. The ground was porous. The boundary between surface and depth was thin. In such an environment, depth commanded respect. It could not be ignored or romanticized. It had to be managed. This practical reality shaped religious language. Enki, the god of wisdom and foresight, is associated with the Abzu not because depth was mysterious, but because depth was where problems originated and where solutions were conceived. Enki's intelligence is not visionary in a celestial sense. It is diagnostic. He understands systems. He anticipates consequences. His wisdom flows upward from a place where origins and endings coexist. By contrast, gods associated primarily with the sky often exercise authority without insight. Enlil, who rules the air and storms, acts decisively but not always wisely. His decrees bring order, but they also provoke unintended consequences. When disasters occur, it is Enki who intervenes from below, mitigating damage, redirecting outcomes, and preserving continuity. This recurring pattern reinforces the idea that depth holds understanding, while height holds command. The Anunnaki further illustrate this principle. Their role is not to initiate creation or inspire progress. They finalize outcomes. They sit in judgment. They determine fate. Their domain is the underworld, not the heavens. Fate is not decided at the peak of the cosmos. It is fixed in its depths. Once a decision passes into their realm, it is no longer subject to revision. This explains why Sumerian texts treat descent with gravity and ascent with flexibility. A being may ascend and return unchanged, but descent alters status permanently. Inanna can rise from the underworld only through intervention, substitution, and loss. What goes down is bound by rules that do not apply above. This asymmetry reflects a deep structural belief. The surface world is dynamic. The heavens move. Stars travel predictable paths. Storms pass. But the underworld is static. It does not evolve. It does not negotiate. It holds what is placed there indefinitely. That permanence grants it authority. Language in Sumerian inscriptions reinforces this view. Words associated with depth carry connotations of firmness, fixing, and finality. Foundations are set, fates are decreed, gates are bolted. By contrast, words associated with height often involve movement and change. Winds shift, skies open and close, light travels. This distinction shapes architecture as well. Ziggurats are often described as connecting heaven and earth, but their descriptions linger on foundations. Inscriptions celebrate how deep they are anchored, how firmly they rest. The height is impressive, but the depth is what makes the structure legitimate. A ziggurat that rises without proper foundation is meaningless, even dangerous. The same principle applies to city planning. Walls are built high, but their strength comes from what is buried below ground level. Moats, foundations, and packed earth provide real defense. Height attracts attention. Depth provides security. When kings boast of their accomplishments, they frequently emphasize the depth of their works. They speak of digging canals, setting foundations, and stabilizing land. These acts demonstrate mastery over depth, not dominance over height. To control water beneath the surface is to control life itself in Mesopotamia. Height offers prestige. Depth offers survival. Even burial practices reflect this worldview. The dead are not elevated. They are placed below, returned to the earth, entrusted to the underworld. The journey is downward. Memory may rise through ritual, but the body is committed to depth. This is not framed as loss. It is framed as return. Over time, later cultures influenced by Mesopotamian thought shifted emphasis toward the sky. Astral religion gained prominence. Celestial omens were read. Gods became more visibly associated with stars. But even then, the oldest structures and rituals retained their focus on the ground. Foundation ceremonies remained elaborate. Underworld gods retained authority over fate. This persistence suggests that depth held a kind of authority that height never fully replaced. Even when people looked to the sky for signs, they continued to build as if what mattered most lay beneath. They sealed, they waited, they reinforced. The Sumerian preference for depth is therefore not symbolic abstraction. It is a rational response to a world where boundaries could fail and consequences would rise upward from below. In such a world, controlling depth was essential. Height could be admired, but depth had to be respected. This perspective also explains why Sumerian records are often quiet about ascent and explicit about descent. Ascension stories are brief. Descent narratives are detailed. The rules of the underworld are specified carefully. Gates are counted. Judges are named. Procedures are fixed. The sky, by contrast, is expansive and less regulated. Depth demands structure because it cannot be escaped. Height invites movement because it allows return. The deeper one goes, the fewer options remain. This logic governs both cosmology and social order. When Sumerian records emphasize depth, they are emphasizing responsibility. They are acknowledging that the most serious decisions occur where reversal is impossible. They are situating authority not where things begin, but where they end. This orientation has profound implications for how monuments are understood. A monument's height may express ambition or reverence, but its depth expresses intent. What lies beneath determines why the structure exists at all. The visible form is secondary. Once this is understood, the consistent pattern across ancient sites becomes clearer. Builders invested enormous effort in foundations because they believed that was where control was exercised. Height was expressive, depth was functional. The Sumerians did not ignore the sky. They simply did not mistake it for the source of order. Order came from below, from containment, from boundaries that held. The sky moved. The ground endured. That belief shaped everything they built, wrote, and preserved. And even as later cultures layered new meanings over old sites, the emphasis on depth remained encoded in stone, clay, and silence. The records speak downward because that is where consequences reside. Height may draw the eye, but depth holds the world together. Long before anyone cut into stone with chisels or lowered ropes into sealed shafts, long before archaeology existed as a discipline with tools, permits, and measured grids, ancient cultures were already speaking about hidden chambers. Not as discoveries waiting to be made, not as mysteries to be solved, but as known features of the world that were not meant for ordinary access. These spaces appear again and again in the earliest myths, described with a familiarity that suggests they were not imaginative inventions, but conceptual realities embedded in how people understood the structure of their environment. In the oldest stories, chambers beneath the earth are not portrayed as empty. They are not forgotten storage spaces or abandoned shelters. They are occupied, governed, and regulated. Access is controlled. Movement is restricted. Entry is deliberate and consequential. These are not places one stumbles into. They are places one is brought to, sealed into or barred from entirely. Sumerian myth speaks of gates beneath the ground long before anyone speaks of tunnels. These gates are counted, named, and guarded. Each one represents a threshold that changes the status of whoever passes through it. This implies a structured interior, not an undefined void. You do not count gates unless there is something between them. You do not guard entrances unless there is something worth guarding. The underworld in these texts is not a metaphorical darkness. It is an organized space with internal divisions. What is striking is how consistent this idea is across cultures that never shared tools or languages. In Egypt, long before pyramid shafts were mapped, the underworld was described as a realm composed of halls, caverns, and chambers through which the dead king travelled. These were not vague afterlife landscapes. They were architectural in language, complete with doors, passages, and sealed areas. The dead did not wander. They followed routes. In Mesoamerican myth, caves beneath ceremonial centres were described as places of emergence and containment. They were associated with origins, but also with danger. Deities emerged from them, but humans did not enter freely. These spaces were acknowledged through ritual rather than explored. When pyramids were later built above them, the mythological understanding of what lay below already existed. The architecture followed the story, not the other way around. This pattern suggests that the idea of hidden chambers predates any physical confirmation. The stories came first, the caution came first, the behaviour came first. Digging came much later, and even then it was limited. When archaeology finally began to uncover chambers beneath ancient monuments, it did not introduce a new concept. It confirmed an old one. The earliest myths do not treat these hidden spaces as secrets waiting to be revealed. They treat them as features of the world that are deliberately withheld from general experience. Knowledge of their existence does not imply permission to access them. In fact, knowing they exist often increases the emphasis on restraint. This is evident in how myths frame curiosity. Curiosity is rarely rewarded when directed downward. Those who descend without authorization face consequences. They are trapped, transformed, or silenced. The danger is not physical harm alone. It is irreversible change. Once something is encountered below, return is no longer guaranteed in the same form. This narrative logic reinforces the idea that these chambers serve a function beyond storage or burial. They are not passive spaces. They are active participants in cosmic order. They hold, confine, or finalize something that must not circulate freely. The mythological language reflects this through repeated emphasis on sealing, binding, and fixing. Even when the purpose of these chambers is not explained directly, their role is implied through behavior. Gods meet there. Judgments are issued there. Fates are finalized there. Decisions made in these spaces are not debated afterward. They stand. This gives the chambers authority independent of the beings who use them. The absence of detailed description is itself significant. Myths do not map these spaces fully. They outline their existence, their rules, and their danger, but they stop short of explaining their contents in detail. This restraint suggests that the stories were not meant to encourage imagination, but to enforce boundaries. You're told enough to know not to go further. When later cultures inherited these myths, the chambers remained part of the worldview, even as surface architecture changed. New gods were named, new rituals developed, but the idea that something lay beneath, sealed and significant, persisted. This continuity suggests that the mythic chambers were not abstract symbols that could be discarded easily. They were placeholders for something understood as real, even if not directly accessible. This becomes especially clear when myths describe construction. When gods build, they build downward first. They establish foundations. They seal spaces. Only afterward do they allow visible structures to rise. This mirrors real-world behavior in ancient construction, where foundations were treated as the most important phase. The myth reflects the practice, reinforcing it. In some traditions, these chambers are associated with knowledge that must be restricted. Tablets of fate, records of decrees or instruments of power are kept below. They are not displayed. They are stored. Access is limited to specific roles. This reinforces the idea that the chamber is a regulatory space, not a repository of forgotten items. The relationship between myth and later archaeology becomes almost inverted here. Archaeology uncovers physical chambers and struggles to explain their purpose. Myth already explained the purpose in behavioral terms, even if it did not describe the physical details. The two align not in specifics, but in intent. This alignment becomes clearer when examining how ancient people reacted to discovering old spaces. When builders encountered earlier chambers during construction, they did not always open them. Often they sealed them again, incorporated them into new foundations, or built over them entirely. This behavior mirrors the mythic instruction. A chamber once closed should remain closed. The idea that some spaces exist precisely so they are not entered runs counter to modern assumptions. Today, discovery is framed as progress. In the ancient world, restraint was often framed as wisdom. Knowing where not to go mattered as much as knowing where to build. This perspective reshapes how myths are read. Rather than exaggerations or symbolic fantasies, they become guides for behavior. They tell people where the boundaries are. They warn against disturbance. They encode rules about depth and access without needing technical explanation. Even when myths speak of descent, it is rarely framed as exploration. It is framed as duty, punishment, or transformation. The underworld is not a place one visits to learn. It is a place one enters to be judged, contained, or altered. This reinforces the idea that chambers below are not neutral spaces. They have function. When archaeology later uncovered chambers beneath monuments, the reaction was often surprise. But for the cultures that built those monuments, the existence of such spaces would not have been surprising at all. What would have been surprising is casual access. The physical evidence aligns with the mythic expectation. Narrow passages, blocked shafts, false doors, dead ends, everything designed to limit movement rather than encourage it. The myths prepared people for this reality long before tools confirmed it. They taught that the world was layered, that not all layers were meant for equal access, that some spaces existed precisely to remain unseen. This understanding helps explain why myths often persist even when their literal meaning fades. The behaviour they encode remains useful. Even when people no longer believe in the gods who guard the chambers, they still feel unease about disturbing them. The caution survives belief. The presence of hidden chambers in myth long before archaeology suggests that ancient people conceptualized depth as structured and intentional. They did not imagine the world beneath their feet as random or hollow. They imagined it as ordered, regulated, and powerful. This conceptual framework guided construction, ritual, and law. It shaped where people built, how they buried, and what they avoided. It provided a logic that did not require physical proof to function. When archaeology eventually revealed chambers beneath monuments, it did not overturn ancient understanding. It echoed it. The stones confirmed what the stories had always implied, that the world below was not empty, that it had been addressed deliberately, that its spaces were designed to remain closed. And once those spaces were closed, the myths did not encourage reopening them. They encouraged memory, respect, and restraint. The story was complete not when the chamber was entered, but when it was sealed. That principle governed ancient behaviour for millennia, shaping landscapes and monuments in ways that are still visible today. The chambers were never hidden because they were unknown. They were hidden because they were known well enough to leave alone. In the earliest traditions, the underworld is not presented as an idea or a metaphor meant to convey moral lessons. It is described as a location, a place with boundaries, structure, and rules. The language used to describe it is practical, directional, and consistent. This matters because symbolism tends to shift across cultures and generations, while descriptions of place tend to preserve function. The underworld, as it appears in the oldest records, behaves like a physical domain that must be managed rather than a symbolic realm meant only for storytelling. Sumerian texts refer to the underworld using terms that imply enclosure and containment. It is a realm that can be entered, exited under rare circumstances, and sealed. It has gates, doors, bolts, and guardians. These are not abstract concepts. They are architectural terms. A gate implies an opening that can be closed. A bolt implies a mechanism designed to prevent movement. A guardian implies enforcement rather than suggestion. The underworld is not imagined as an emotional state or a moral condition. It is imagined as a controlled environment. The consistency of these descriptions across independent texts suggests that the writers were not inventing imagery for poetic effect. They were drawing from a shared understanding of how the world was structured. The surface world existed above, the heavens existed beyond, and beneath the surface was a domain that was neither chaotic nor free, but regulated and final. This physical framing becomes clearer when examining how descent is described. Characters do not drift into the underworld. They pass through specific points. In the myth of Inanna's descent, the goddess moves through 7 gates, each requiring the surrender of something tangible. These are not psychological stages. They are checkpoints. Each gate marks a transition that cannot be reversed casually. The process resembles passage through a controlled facility rather than movement through a dreamscape. Once inside, the underworld does not behave like a symbolic mirror of human fears. It operates according to fixed procedures. Judgments are issued, decrees are enforced, time behaves differently, movement is restricted, even gods are subject to its rules. This is not how metaphor functions. Metaphor bends to narrative needs. The underworld does not bend, it holds. The Anunnaki's role reinforces this interpretation. They are not teachers or guides, they are judges. Their authority is exercised in the underworld, not the sky. Judgment requires a stable environment, a place where outcomes are recorded and preserved. A physical place supports this function more naturally than an abstract symbol. Sumerian legal thinking parallels this structure. Laws are fixed, inscribed, and stored. They are not flexible narratives. Once issued, they stand. The underworld functions as the cosmic equivalent of a legal archive. Decisions made there are final. There is no appeal beyond it. This aligns with its portrayal as a place of no return for most beings. The idea of the underworld as physical also explains why it is consistently associated with weight. The dead are described as being pressed down. The realm itself is heavy. This heaviness is not emotional. It is spatial. The language implies pressure and containment. To be in the underworld is to be held in place. This understanding shaped burial practices. The dead were not elevated toward the sky. They were placed below ground, returned to the domain that governed endings. Graves were sealed. Tombs were closed. Even when grave goods were included, the emphasis was on containment. The body was not meant to circulate. It was meant to remain. In Egypt, despite differences in theology, the underworld retains this physicality. The Duat is described as a landscape with roots, obstacles, and chambers. The deceased king travels through it using specific paths. Knowledge of these paths is necessary for success. This is not symbolic abstraction. It is logistical description. The emphasis is on navigation, not moral reflection. In Mesopotamia, the underworld is similarly navigable only to those with authorization or assistance. Enki's interventions often involve circumventing underworld rules rather than abolishing them. He sends emissaries. He exploits loopholes. He does not deny the underworld's authority. This suggests that the realm operates according to rules even gods must respect. The physicality of the underworld also explains why it is associated with silence. Once sealed, it does not communicate outward freely. Information flows downward more easily than upward. This asymmetry reinforces containment. What is placed below remains below. This principle is repeated in construction practices, where foundations are sealed and rarely reopened. Myths describing the creation of the underworld emphasize its establishment as a domain that must exist for the cosmos to function. It is not an accident. It is not a punishment invented later. It is part of the original architecture of reality. The cosmos requires a place where things end, where decisions stop moving, where instability is absorbed rather than expressed. This absorption function is critical. The underworld takes in what the surface world cannot hold indefinitely. Death, excess, irreversibility. By confining these elements below, the surface world remains dynamic. Life continues because endings are managed elsewhere. This division of labour requires the underworld to be stable, inaccessible, and controlled. When disasters occur, they are often described as breaches of this containment. Floods, plagues, and collapses represent moments when boundaries fail and what should remain below intrudes upward. These events are framed as catastrophic, not because they introduce something new, but because they undo containment. The underworld's contents are not meant to circulate. This perspective casts monumental architecture in a different light. Structures built over significant sites function as reinforcements. They add weight. They stabilize boundaries. They ensure that the underworld remains contained. The monument is not merely symbolic of divine power. It is a physical solution to a physical problem. The reluctance to excavate deeply beneath ancient monuments aligns with this worldview. Digging downward risks disturbing containment. Even when curiosity exists, restraint prevails. The cost of disturbance is perceived as too high. This is not superstition. It is consistent behaviour based on inherited understanding. As cultures evolved, symbolic interpretations layered over this physical framework. The underworld became associated with morality, punishment, or reward. But these interpretations did not replace the physical model. They coexisted with it. The rules of access remained strict. The gates remained closed. The persistence of underworld imagery across millennia suggests that it fulfilled a practical conceptual role. It provided a way to think about finality, containment and order without requiring constant intervention. Once something passed into the underworld, it was accounted for. The system held. This accounting function explains why records of the dead are often minimal. Once buried individuals pass out of the narrative, they're no longer active participants. Their stories end. This narrative closure mirrors physical containment, even in later periods. When philosophies abstracted reality further, the language of depth retained its authority. Hell, Sheol, Hades, and similar concepts retained spatial characteristics. They were places, not moods. Their geography mattered. The underworld as a physical place provided a stable endpoint for processes that could not remain open-ended. It allowed ancient societies to manage fear, loss, and excess without constant renegotiation. The rules were clear. The space was defined. The boundary held. This understanding also clarifies why the underworld is rarely celebrated. It is respected, feared, and avoided. It is necessary but not desirable. This is how infrastructure is treated, not symbols. Infrastructure is acknowledged through maintenance, not admiration. When myths describe the underworld, they are not inviting contemplation. They are issuing instructions. This exists. It is governed. Do not enter without cause. Do not disturb what is contained. These instructions shaped behaviour long after the original texts were written. Even when people no longer believed in the gods who ruled below, they continued to act as if the space itself retained authority. Sacred ground remained undisturbed. Foundations remained sealed. Understanding the underworld as a physical place rather than a symbol explains this continuity. Symbols fade when beliefs change. Physical assumptions persist when behaviour reinforces them. The underworld's authority endured because it was embedded in how people interacted with the world. The stones placed above, the chambers sealed below, and the silence maintained around them all reflect a world-view that treated depth as real, consequential, and demanding respect. The underworld did not need to be seen to be acknowledged. Its presence was felt through restraint. This restraint is one of the most consistent features of ancient behaviour. It appears in law, architecture, myth, and ritual. It does not depend on belief in any single god or story. It depends on the assumption that some spaces exist precisely to remain closed. The underworld, in this sense, was not an idea people believed in. It was a condition they lived with. It defined limits. It stabilized the world. It absorbed what could not remain above. And because it performed that function reliably, it did not need constant explanation. It was built into the structure of reality as ancient people understood it. They spoke of it plainly, guarded it carefully, and built their monuments as if it were always there, holding everything else in place. When the Anunnaki appear in the earliest Sumerian records, they are not introduced through spectacle. There is no arrival narrative, no descent from the sky, no moment of revelation meant to be witnessed by humanity. Instead, they are named quietly, embedded into the structure of the world as it already exists. Their presence is implied through function rather than action, through location rather than movement. And that location is consistently below, not above. This detail is often overlooked because later interpretations, both ancient and modern, reframe the Anunnaki through more dramatic imagery. But when the oldest texts are read carefully, stripped of later embellishment, a different picture emerges. The Anunnaki are not associated with what is displayed, elevated, or celebrated. They are associated with what is fixed, contained, and buried. Their authority does not depend on visibility. It depends on finality. In Sumerian cosmology, visibility is not the same as importance. What is visible belongs to the realm of activity, change, and negotiation. What is buried belongs to the realm of decision, consequence, and permanence. The Anunnaki occupy this second category. They are not gods of process. They are gods of outcome. This is why their most consistent role across texts is judgment. They do not initiate events. They do not guide daily life. They do not teach or invent. They determine what happens after actions are complete. They finalize. Their judgments are not revised. Their decrees are not debated. Once something passes into their domain, it is no longer in motion. The underworld, where the Anunnaki are most often located, is described as sealed, ordered and governed by rules that even major gods must respect. This is not the domain of spectacle. It is the domain of closure. The Anunnaki are not there to be seen. They are there to ensure that what is placed there remains there. This association explains why the Anunnaki are repeatedly linked to burial rather than to monuments meant for display. Burial is the act of removing something from circulation. It is not erasure, it is containment. The buried object still exists, but it no longer participates in the visible world. This is precisely the logic that governs the Anunnaki's authority. In myths where they appear directly, their actions are restrained and procedural. In the story of Inanna's descent, they do not argue or persuade. They do not display emotion. They simply enforce the rules. When Inanna enters the underworld, the Anunnaki fix their gaze upon her, and she dies. Not violently, not dramatically. She is rendered inert, held in place. This is not an act of cruelty. It is an act of jurisdiction. The gaze itself is telling. The Anunnaki do not need weapons or force. Their authority operates through recognition and acknowledgement. Once something is seen by them, it is accounted for. It cannot continue unchanged. This reinforces their connection to what is buried. Burial is not about hiding. It is about acknowledging that something has reached a state where it must be fixed and removed from further change. This perspective aligns with how the Sumerians understood fate. Fate was not a prediction. It was a condition. Once fixed, it could not be undone. The Anunnaki are repeatedly described as those who decree fate, not those who foresee it. Their decrees do not guide behavior in advance. They define outcomes after the fact. The fact that these decrees are issued in the underworld matters. The underworld is not a place of beginnings. It is a place of endings. It is where things stop moving. It is where instability is absorbed. The Anunnaki preside over this absorption. They are not architects of possibility. They are custodians of limitation. This custodial role makes them incompatible with the idea of being visibly worshipped through towering displays. Their power does not increase with attention. In fact, their function requires distance. The underworld works because it is separate, inaccessible, and sealed. If it were visible and open, it would fail in its role. This is why temples associated with underworld deities are often understated or deeply rooted rather than elevated. When rituals involve the Anunnaki, they emphasize submission, acknowledgement, and restraint rather than celebration. Offerings are made quietly. Names are spoken carefully. The tone is procedural, not ecstatic. This behavior mirrors how people treat legal authority rather than charismatic leadership. Legal authority does not require constant display. It requires consistency. The Anunnaki embody this kind of authority on a cosmic scale. They are the guarantors that decisions will hold. Their association with burial also explains why they are rarely individualized in narratives. Unlike gods associated with the sky, storms, or fertility, the Anunnaki are often described collectively. They function as a body, a council, or a group. This reinforces their role as an institution rather than as personalities. Institutions do not need faces, they need rules. When later traditions begin to describe gods as more personal, more emotional, and more visible, the Anunnaki remain unchanged. They do not acquire dramatic myths or elaborate temples. Their role remains stable because it serves a necessary function that does not benefit from embellishment. This stability extends into how physical space was treated. Places associated with underworld authority were not marked for gathering. They were marked for avoidance or controlled access. When construction occurred over such places, it was done to reinforce boundaries, not to invite interaction. The immense weight of monuments built over certain sites can be understood through this lens. These structures do not announce the presence of the Anunnaki. They respond to it. They add pressure where pressure is needed. They ensure that what has been fixed remains fixed. In this sense, the Anunnaki are linked to buried foundations rather than visible architecture. The visible structure is for the living. The buried foundation is for what must not return. The Anunnaki's authority operates at that deeper level. This distinction also explains why modern interpretations that focus on visibility struggle to align with the texts. The assumption that powerful beings must be seen, must arrive, must leave traces above ground, runs counter to the Sumerian framework. In that framework, the most powerful forces are the least visible. The sky changes constantly. Clouds move. Stars rise and set. Storms come and go. These phenomena are impressive, but they are transient. The underworld does not change. Its gates do not move. Its rules do not shift. This permanence grants it authority that the sky cannot match. The Anunnaki's connection to permanence rather than display is also reflected in how they are remembered. They do not inspire heroic narratives. They inspire caution. Their memory persists not through storytelling, but through behaviour. People avoid disturbing certain places. They seal foundations carefully. They respect boundaries without always knowing why. This inherited behaviour is one of the strongest indicators that the Anunnaki were understood as linked to containment rather than revelation. If their role were to teach or inspire, their stories would encourage engagement. Instead, the stories encourage restraint. Even when later cultures reinterpret the Anunnaki or merge them with other divine figures, this core association remains. They remain judges. They remain connected to the dead. They remain below. The surface may change, but the depth holds. This continuity suggests that the Anunnaki fulfilled a conceptual need that did not diminish with time. Societies require a way to think about finality, limitation, and closure. The Anunnaki provided that framework. They explained why not everything could remain open-ended, why some things had to be sealed away. This framework also supported social order. If fate is fixed below, then not all disputes can be resolved above. If outcomes are final, then authority must be respected. The underworld becomes the ultimate reference point for decisions that cannot be appealed. When monuments are built, they often commemorate victories, rulers, or gods associated with the surface world. But their foundations serve a different purpose. They stabilize. They close. They mark the end of something older. The Anunnaki's presence is felt there, not announced above. This interpretation reframes ancient architecture. Instead of seeing monuments as messages to the heavens, they become responses to the depths. They are acts of management rather than expression. They address what cannot be allowed to move. The Anunnaki do not need to be visible because their function does not depend on recognition. Once a boundary is set, it holds whether anyone remembers who set it or not. This is the highest form of authority in the Sumerian worldview. Authority that does not require maintenance through display. Over time, the visible gods change, names shift, myths evolve. But the Anunnaki remain linked to what is buried because burial represents the moment when change stops. That moment must be governed, or chaos follows. Understanding this removes the need for speculative explanations about hidden arrivals or secret technologies. The texts are not pointing upward because they are not concerned with arrival. They are concerned with containment. The Anunnaki are not hidden because they are secretive. They are hidden because their domain is not meant to be seen. They exist where things are finished, where movement ends, where boundaries are sealed. And that is why they are linked not to monuments that rise into view, but to foundations that press down, unseen, holding the weight of everything built above them. The visible world moves on. The buried world holds. The Anunnaki belong to the latter. When temples are imagined today, They are usually understood as places of gathering, spaces meant to invite presence, encourage movement, and draw attention upward towards symbols, statues, or altars. This understanding fits later religious traditions well, but it does not align cleanly with the earliest temple architecture or with the way those structures are described in the oldest records. In the earliest contexts, temples did not function primarily as open shrines. They functioned as seals. This distinction changes how every stone, wall, and foundation is interpreted. A shrine is built to be approached. A seal is built to remain intact. Shrines invite repeated access. Seals demand preservation. When the earliest temples are examined with this difference in mind, their behavior begins to make more sense than when they are treated as purely devotional spaces. In Sumerian cities, temples were often the first permanent structures erected. They were not additions to a city that had already stabilized. They were stabilizing instruments themselves. Their placement preceded dense habitation. In some cases, they existed before surrounding neighborhoods developed. This suggests that their purpose was not simply to serve a population, but to define a boundary around a particular location. The architectural features of early temples support this interpretation. Access points were limited, interiors were segmented, certain areas were restricted even to priests. The most important spaces were not the most visible ones. They were the most protected. The deeper one moved into a temple complex, the fewer people were permitted to follow. This is not the layout of a building meant for communal experience. It is the layout of a controlled structure. Foundation rituals further reinforce this role. Objects buried beneath temples were not meant to be retrieved. They were placed out of sight, sealed permanently and forgotten in practical terms. Their purpose was not symbolic communication with worshippers. It was the marking of closure. Once placed, they were never meant to be disturbed. The language used in temple inscriptions reflects this intention. Kings boast of sealing foundations, securing corners, fixing boundaries, and making structures firm. These phrases are not decorative. They describe actions taken to ensure immobility. The success of a temple was measured by how long it remained undisturbed, not by how many people passed through it. This perspective also explains why temples were rebuilt repeatedly on the same footprint. When older temples decayed or were damaged, new ones were erected directly above them rather than elsewhere. The goal was not architectural novelty, it was continuity of pressure. Each new temple added weight, reinforcing the seal placed by earlier builders. Over time, these repeated rebuildings created massive platforms composed of layered foundations. Ziggurats did not rise suddenly. They accumulated. Each phase reinforced the one beneath it. The visible height was the result of repeated acts of sealing rather than a single act of elevation. The choice of materials further supports this interpretation. Temples were built using materials that resisted erosion, compression, and movement. Stone, fired brick, and compacted earth were favoured not just for durability, but for mass. The sheer weight of these materials mattered. A seal must resist pressure from below as much as pressure from above. This concern is reflected in flood-prone regions like southern Mesopotamia, where temples were elevated on platforms well above surrounding terrain. This elevation is often interpreted as symbolic or defensive, but it also served to anchor the structure against water intrusion. The platform acted as a barrier between unstable ground and the controlled space above it. Importantly, the interior of temples was not designed for spectacle. There were no grand open halls in the earliest phases. Light was limited. Movement was constrained. The focus was inward and downward rather than outward and upward. This is consistent with a sealing function rather than a celebratory one. When later traditions describe temples as houses of gods, this language can obscure the original purpose. A house suggests habitation. But the earliest temples were not places where gods lived comfortably. They were places where divine presence was contained and regulated. Offerings were made to maintain balance, not to invite constant visitation. The gods associated with these temples often reinforce this interpretation. Deities linked to temples were frequently associated with boundaries, law, water control, and fate, rather than with personal devotion or ecstatic worship. Their rituals emphasized order and maintenance rather than emotional expression. This maintenance aspect is crucial. Temples required constant care not because gods were fragile, but because the boundary they represented needed reinforcement. Daily rituals, offerings, and recitations were acts of upkeep. They acknowledged the presence of something fixed in place and ensured that its status remained unchanged. Silence played an important role in this process. Certain knowledge was not spoken openly. Certain names were uttered only in specific contexts. The most important aspects of temple function were not explained to the general population. This secrecy was not about mystery for its own sake. It was about preventing disturbance. When temples are described in myths, they often appear as points of negotiation between realms rather than as centres of celebration. They are places where decrees are issued, boundaries are reaffirmed, and balance is restored. These functions align more closely with sealing than with worship as it is understood today. The idea of temples as seals also explains why many ancient temples appear curiously empty by modern standards. Archaeologists often note the absence of extensive furnishings or decorations in the earliest phases. This absence is not evidence of primitiveness. It is evidence of restraint. The space was not meant to be filled with activity. It was meant to remain controlled. In some cases, the most significant feature of a temple is what it covers rather than what it contains. Natural features like springs, caves, or fissures are frequently located beneath temple foundations. Rather than exploiting these features openly, builders chose to cover them, incorporating them into the structure without granting access. This behaviour mirrors mythological instructions. The underworld is not to be entered freely. Its gates are guarded. Its spaces are regulated. By building temples over points of perceived access, ancient societies created physical enforcement of mythological boundaries. Later religious developments often reinterpreted these structures. Temples became places of public worship, pilgrimage, and spectacle. But these functions were layered onto an older framework. The original sealing function did not disappear. It was simply obscured by new meanings. This layering can be seen in how later cultures treated ancient temple sites. They rarely dismantled them entirely. Even when religious beliefs changed, the sites were reused, recontextualized, and reinterpreted. The ground itself retained significance, the seal remained intact. This persistence suggests that the original purpose of these temples was never fully forgotten, even if it was no longer articulated clearly. People continued to behave as if disturbing these sites would have consequences. Laws protected them, rituals maintained them, excavation was avoided. The contrast between temples and other types of buildings reinforces this interpretation. Palaces, markets, and residences changed location, design, and orientation freely. Temples did not. Their placement was fixed. Their foundations were sacrosanct. This difference reflects function rather than status. Even the orientation of temples often reflects concern with stability rather than visibility. Alignments with cardinal directions ensured predictability and balance. The building became an anchor point in both physical and symbolic space. When temples collapsed or were destroyed, their rebuilding was often accompanied by renewed foundation rituals. This suggests that the seal was considered compromised and needed restoration. The emphasis was not on replacing a shrine, but on re-establishing a boundary. This behaviour aligns closely with how seals function in other contexts. A broken seal must be replaced to restore authority. A damaged temple required rebuilding not because the god needed a new house, but because the boundary needed repair. Understanding temples as seals also clarifies why certain spaces within them were never meant to be accessed. Inner sanctums were not hidden because they were sacred in a sentimental sense. They were hidden because disturbance would undermine the structure's purpose. This interpretation also sheds light on the relationship between temples and monuments. Monuments often rise above temples or incorporate them. This layering adds weight and permanence. Each new construction reinforces the original seal rather than replacing it. The visible grandeur of later monuments can therefore be seen as a byproduct of repeated reinforcement rather than as the original intent. The first builders were concerned with closure, not display. Display emerged later as societies grew and meanings evolved. This perspective challenges modern assumptions about ancient religion. It suggests that the earlier sacred architecture was not about drawing people in, but about keeping something in place. Worship was maintenance. Ritual was reinforcement. Architecture was containment. Once this framework is adopted, many puzzling features of ancient temples become coherent. The restricted access, the emphasis on foundations, the lack of explanatory inscriptions, the reluctance to excavate beneath them, all point toward a function that goes beyond devotion. Temples were interfaces between worlds, but not open doors. They were pressure points where boundaries were held firm. They acknowledged the presence of something powerful without allowing it to move freely. This role required permanence, silence, and care rather than constant interaction. The temple did not need to be impressive to fulfill its function. It needed to endure, and because endurance was the goal, the temple became one of the most stable features of ancient cities. Empires rose and fell around them. Languages changed. Gods merged and transformed. But the temple footprint remained. The seal held. What modern observers interpret as reverence may, in its earliest form, have been caution. What appears as worship may have begun as maintenance. The shift from seal to shrine occurred gradually, as memory faded and meaning was layered onto structure. But beneath those layers, the original purpose still shapes behaviour. The ground remains protected. The foundations remain untouched. The silence remains. Temples endure not because they invite us upward, but because they hold something down. Across continents and millennia, one pattern repeats with such consistency that it becomes difficult to dismiss as coincidence. Wherever monumental architecture appears, it is rarely the first thing to occupy that ground. Beneath the visible structure, there is almost always an older space. Sometimes it is a previous building, sometimes a platform, sometimes a chamber, a cave, a foundation, or a void. What changes is the surface expression. What remains constant is the decision not to erase what came before, but to build over it. This pattern is not limited to a single culture or period. It appears in the earlier cities of Mesopotamia, along the Nile, across the Levant, throughout Mesoamerica, and in parts of Asia. The forms vary, the materials change, the myths differ, but the behaviour remains remarkably similar. Instead of clearing ground and starting anew, builders repeatedly chose to layer. They placed weight on top of earlier spaces rather than removing them. From a modern perspective, this can seem inefficient or even illogical. Clearing an old structure might appear simpler than reinforcing it. Excavating and rebuilding from bedrock might seem safer than stacking one foundation atop another. Yet ancient builders consistently avoided disturbing the deepest layers. The choice to build over rather than dig down was deliberate. In Mesopotamia, this behaviour created the great tells that still dominate the landscape. These artificial mounds are not natural hills. They are the accumulated result of centuries of construction layered atop earlier remains. Each generation levelled what stood, reinforced it, and built again. The ground surface rose steadily, but the deepest layers were never removed. They were sealed ever more firmly beneath the weight of time. The same phenomenon appears in Egypt, though expressed differently. At sites like Abydos, Saqqara and Giza, later structures sit atop earlier ones, often aligned carefully with what came before. Even when architectural styles shifted dramatically, builders respected earlier orientations and footprints. Older spaces were not erased, they were absorbed. In the Levant, sacred sites show similar continuity. Successive temples, sanctuaries, and later religious buildings occupy the same ground. Each new structure inherits not just the location, but the obligation to preserve what lies beneath. Excavation is limited. Access points are sealed. The deeper layers remain largely untouched. In Mesoamerica, pyramids were famously built over earlier pyramids, which themselves often covered earlier structures or natural caves. This layering was not hidden. It was intentional. Builders encased older spaces within newer ones, increasing mass and permanence with each phase. The earlier space did not lose significance. It gained protection. What makes this pattern especially striking is that it persists even when the function of the site changes. A ritual platform becomes a temple. A temple becomes a palace. A palace becomes a religious complex under a new belief system. The surface meaning shifts, but the treatment of the ground does not. Whatever lies beneath remains sealed. This continuity suggests that the earliest builders recognized certain places as already marked. Their significance did not originate with architecture. Architecture responded to it. Later generations inherited both the location and the instruction, even if the original reason was no longer fully understood. In many cases, archaeological evidence shows that the earlier spaces beneath monuments were not grand or elaborate. They might be modest chambers, simple platforms, or natural features adapted for use. Their importance was not aesthetic, it was positional. They occupied a place that mattered. The decision to build over these spaces transformed them. Once sealed, they were no longer active in daily life. They became fixed reference points. Their influence was indirect, expressed through the behaviour of those who avoided disturbing them. This pattern also explains why so many monuments appear to have limited or confusing access to their deepest levels. Passages that lead nowhere, shafts that end abruptly, chambers that are sealed without explanation. These features are often described as unfinished or symbolic, but they make more sense when viewed as deliberate closures. If a monument's purpose were purely expressive, one would expect the most important spaces to be accessible and visible. Instead, the opposite is often true. The deeper one goes, the less accessible the space becomes. This inversion suggests that the value of the space lies not in interaction, but in containment. The repeated act of building over older spaces also creates temporal layering. Each generation adds its own interpretation to the site while preserving the physical decisions of the past. Over time, the original function becomes obscured, but the behaviour persists. The site remains protected, reinforced, and respected. This behaviour reflects a worldview in which the past is not something to be erased, but something to be stabilised. Ancient societies did not approach history as a series of clean breaks. They saw it as accumulation. Each layer added responsibility rather than replacing it. This accumulation is especially visible in sacred architecture. The oldest layer sets the terms. Later layers operate within those terms. Even when power shifts or belief systems change, the foundational decision remains binding. The reluctance to disturb older spaces may also reflect a belief that certain actions have irreversible consequences. Once something has been fixed into place, removing it risks destabilizing more than just the structure. It risks undoing an agreement made long ago. This agreement may not have been fully articulated in later periods, but it was honoured nonetheless. The site had been addressed. The ground had been stabilised. There was no need to reopen the question. This understanding sheds light on why ancient construction often appears conservative, despite technological advancement. Builders had the capability to excavate deeply. They had tools, labour, and time, yet they chose restraint. They chose reinforcement over exploration. This restraint aligns with mythological instruction. Descent without authorization leads to punishment. Disturbance of sealed spaces leads to disaster. The stories reinforce the behavior, and the behavior reinforces the stories. When modern archaeology uncovers these layered sites, it often focuses on the visible sequence of construction, but the deeper pattern is behavioral. The repeated choice to build over rather than dig down reflects a shared assumption that certain spaces were better left undisturbed. Even when ancient builders encountered unknown spaces during construction, the response was often to seal and move upward rather than investigate. This suggests that curiosity was secondary to stability. Knowing that a space existed did not imply permission to explore it. The accumulation of monuments over older spaces also had a practical effect. Each new layer increased the difficulty of access. What might have been reachable in the earliest period became inaccessible centuries later. The act of sealing became irreversible through repetition. This process transformed sites into permanent fixtures. They became anchors in the landscape, immune to ordinary change. Even when abandoned, they remained. Their weight kept them in place. Their presence shaped future settlement patterns. The persistence of this pattern across cultures suggests that it addressed a common human concern: the need to manage places perceived as powerful or dangerous, the need to stabilize boundaries between known and unknown, the need to ensure continuity in a world subject to change. By building over older spaces, ancient societies created physical guarantees. The past was not erased, but it was contained. The present could proceed without constantly renegotiating what lay beneath. This containment did not require constant explanation. It was encoded in architecture and ritual. People learned where not to dig by observing where others had built. Over time, the original reason for the containment may have faded, but the structure remained. New myths formed around old sites. New meanings were attached, but the behavior did not change. This is why monuments often feel older than their visible age. They carry weight not just physically, but historically. They sit atop decisions made long before their current form existed. The repeated pattern of building over older spaces reveals a deep continuity in human behavior. It shows that ancient people did not see the ground as empty or neutral. They saw it as layered, active, and requiring management. Monuments were one of the tools used to provide that management. They were not just expressions of belief or power. They were practical responses to inherited conditions. Understanding this pattern reframes ancient architecture. It stops being a series of isolated achievements and becomes a long conversation across generations, each builder responding to what was already there, choosing reinforcement over disruption. The monument we see today is therefore only the most recent reply in that conversation. Beneath it lies a chain of earlier responses, each one adding weight, each one reaffirming the decision to keep certain spaces sealed. That decision did not need to be spoken aloud anymore. It was written in stone, layer by layer, until the ground itself became unreachable, and once it became unreachable, the purpose of sealing it was complete. When modern observers encounter ancient sites that appear unfinished, partially explored, or strangely avoided, the assumption is often that something was missing. That work stopped because of collapse, lack of resources, political disruption, or simple abandonment. But when this pattern repeats across cultures, periods, and geographies, a different explanation becomes more plausible. Certain sites were not left unexcavated because ancient builders could not continue. They were left unexcavated because continuation was neither intended nor permitted. The idea that excavation represents progress is a modern value. In the ancient world, excavation carried risk. Digging downward meant disturbing layers that were not considered neutral. Depth was associated with permanence, finality, and forces that did not respond well to interference. The deeper one went, the fewer protections existed. This understanding shaped behavior far more consistently than curiosity ever did. At many monumental sites, the visible architecture suggests extraordinary technical capability. Builders moved massive stones, leveled terrain with precision, and engineered complex internal structures. These same builders were fully capable of digging deeper if they had chosen to do so. The absence of deep excavation at specific points is therefore not a sign of limitation, it is a sign of restraint. This restraint is often most visible at the exact locations modern researchers find most compelling. Beneath central platforms, under inner sanctums, below the heaviest concentrations of stone. These are the places where excavation stops abruptly, where passages are sealed, where shafts descend only so far before being deliberately blocked. The pattern is not random. It follows the logic of containment rather than exploration. In Mesopotamia, temple complexes frequently show extensive rebuilding at the surface level, while leaving deeper layers untouched. Archaeological trenches reveal repeated phases of construction, each one carefully laid atop the previous without disturbing what lay beneath. Even when foundations needed reinforcement, builders chose to add material rather than remove earlier layers. This approach increased stability while preserving closure. The same behaviour appears in Egypt, where monumental structures sit atop bedrock that could have been cut further but was left intact. Beneath pyramids, excavation is limited and tightly controlled. Chambers exist, but they do not extend indefinitely. Where natural cavities or fissures were encountered, they were often incorporated into the structure and sealed rather than expanded. The choice was to stabilize, not to investigate. In the Levant, sacred precincts show similar patterns. Areas believed to be foundational to the site's significance were protected from deep disturbance, even as surface architecture changed dramatically. When later builders encountered older spaces, they reinforced them rather than opening them. Legal and ritual prohibitions grew around these areas, ensuring continuity of avoidance. In Mesoamerica, caves beneath ceremonial centres were acknowledged through ritual, but rarely explored fully. Even when cave systems extended far beyond the visible architecture, access was limited. Certain chambers were left untouched, marked only by offerings placed at entrances. The message was clear: recognition did not imply permission. This behaviour reflects an ancient understanding that some spaces served a function precisely because they were not accessed. Their role was passive but essential. They held something in place. They absorbed pressure. They stabilised the relationship between surface life and deeper forces. The myths reinforce this logic. Descent is never casual. It requires authorization, guidance, or divine intervention. Unauthorized descent leads to loss, transformation, or permanent confinement. These stories are not abstract moral lessons. They are behavioral instructions encoded in narrative form. When builders chose not to excavate further, they were following these instructions. They were acknowledging that certain thresholds should not be crossed. The cost of disturbance was understood to outweigh the benefit of discovery. This perspective also explains why some excavations appear to stop just short of revealing something significant. Modern observers may see a sealed shaft or blocked passage and assume incompleteness. But from the ancient perspective, that closure was the goal. The act of sealing completed the work. Opening it would undo the purpose of construction. The materials used to block access are often more durable than those used elsewhere in the structure. Heavy stone plugs, compacted fill, and carefully fitted blocks appear at critical points. These were not temporary measures, they were intended to last. Their placement required planning, labour, and foresight. They represent deliberate decisions rather than improvisation. In some cases, the effort required to seal a space exceeds the effort required to excavate it in the first place. This inversion makes little sense if the goal were exploration. It makes perfect sense if the goal were containment. Over time, this containment became institutionalized. Laws, taboos, and religious restrictions emerged to protect certain sites from disturbance. Even when original myths faded, the restrictions remained. Later generations inherited the behaviour without always understanding the rationale. The site was known to be off-limits. That knowledge was enough. This inheritance can be seen in how later cultures treated ancient ruins. Even when a site was abandoned or repurposed, certain areas remained untouched. New buildings rose nearby, but not directly over specific points. The ground retained a kind of authority independent of current belief systems. Modern excavation often encounters resistance at these same sites, not only from physical obstacles, but from cultural ones. Religious sensitivity, legal protection, and local unease converge. The reluctance to dig is not purely academic. It reflects a continuity of caution that stretches back thousands of years. This continuity suggests that the original decision to limit excavation was effective. The boundary held. The space remained undisturbed long enough to become unquestioned. Over generations, the reason may have faded, but the behaviour persisted. The idea that ancient people avoided excavation because of fear or superstition underestimates their practical intelligence. These were societies capable of long-term planning, complex engineering, and sustained cultural memory. Their restraint was not ignorance, it was strategy. In flood-prone environments, deep excavation could destabilize structures. In regions with high water tables, digging too far risked uncontrolled seepage. These practical concerns reinforced mythological caution. The environment itself punished boundary violations, validating inherited beliefs. But practicality alone does not explain the consistency of avoidance across environments where deep excavation would have been feasible. The pattern persists even in dry, stable regions. This suggests that the underlying logic was conceptual, rather than purely environmental. Certain sites were treated as fixed points in the world structure. Their depth mattered. Disturbing that depth risked altering something fundamental. Excavation was therefore not a neutral act. It was an intervention with potential consequences beyond immediate visibility. This understanding aligns with how ancient societies approached other irreversible actions. Treaties, decrees, and rituals were treated with similar caution. Once enacted, they were not easily undone. Depth represented irreversibility in physical form. When excavation did occur, it was often highly ritualized and limited in scope. Wells, for example, were dug carefully, with offerings made to acknowledge what was being accessed. Even then, wells followed known patterns and depths. They did not explore arbitrarily. The same care applied to burial. Graves were dug to specific depths, sealed carefully, and marked. Disturbance of graves was taboo not only for moral reasons, but because it represented a breach of containment. The dead were meant to remain where they were placed. This logic extended to architecture. Foundations were placed, sealed, and left alone. They did their work quietly. Later builders respected them because they understood that disturbing foundations risked destabilizing everything above. The sites that were never fully excavated are therefore not anomalies. They are examples of this logic applied consistently. The absence of excavation is evidence of successful containment rather than incomplete effort. From this perspective, modern frustration at blocked passages or sealed chambers reflects a clash of values rather than a failure of ancient design. Modern archaeology seeks to reveal. Ancient architecture sought to conceal, not out of secrecy, but out of necessity. The purpose of these sites was not to provide answers to future generations. It was to solve a problem in their own time. Once that problem was addressed, the solution did not require explanation. Understanding this helps reframe many debates about ancient structures. Instead of asking what lies beyond a sealed passage, the more revealing question becomes why sealing was considered sufficient. The answer lies not in fear of discovery, but in confidence that containment worked. The site no longer needed attention. It could be left alone. This confidence is reflected in the patience of ancient construction. Builders invested enormous effort into sealing spaces they never intended to revisit. They trusted future generations to maintain the seal rather than challenge it. In many cases, that trust was rewarded. The sites remained undisturbed for centuries. Even when empires collapsed and languages disappeared, the ground remained protected. This protection was not enforced by constant surveillance. It was enforced by shared understanding. Certain places were not to be touched. The reason did not need to be restated. The fact that modern excavation struggles to penetrate these sites is not a failure of archaeology. It is a testament to the effectiveness of ancient restraint. The boundary still holds. These sites were never fully excavated because they were never meant to be. Their purpose was fulfilled when the decision to stop digging was made. What remains above ground continues to change. Interpretations evolve. Theories multiply. But beneath the surface, the ancient decision remains intact, holding its place quietly, doing exactly what it was designed to do, and as long as that decision holds, the absence of excavation is not a mystery. It is the result. When ancient cultures encountered knowledge they believed could not circulate freely, their response was rarely destruction. Burning, erasure, and annihilation are dramatic acts, but they are also unstable ones. Destruction leaves absence, and absence invites replacement, reinterpretation, and speculation. What the earliest societies preferred instead was confinement. Knowledge that was considered dangerous, premature, or destabilizing was not eliminated. It was placed where it could no longer act. This distinction is crucial. Destruction removes information from the world entirely. Confinement removes it from circulation while preserving its existence. The Sumerian texts consistently suggest the second approach. When something was judged unsuitable for the surface world, it was sealed away, assigned to the underworld, or placed beyond ordinary access. The knowledge remained intact, but inert. This pattern appears first in how divine knowledge is described. The gods do not scatter understanding indiscriminately. Knowledge is distributed carefully, often reluctantly and frequently with consequences. When boundaries are crossed, the response is not to erase the knowledge, but to contain its effects. The emphasis is on control rather than suppression. The mythological language reflects this clearly. Tablets of destiny, decrees of fate, and records of judgment are not destroyed when contested. They are seized, guarded, hidden, or relocated. Their power comes from their continued existence, not from their visibility. A decree that ceases to exist has no authority. A decree that exists but cannot be accessed retains absolute power. This logic mirrors legal practice. Laws are not burned when inconvenient. They are archived, locked away, preserved as reference points even when not actively enforced. The underworld functions as the cosmic archive in Sumerian thought. It is where records are finalized and stored beyond revision. The Anunnaki's role aligns precisely with this function. They do not erase outcomes, they fix them. Once a fate is decreed, it does not vanish. It becomes unchangeable. This unchangeability requires preservation, not destruction. Something destroyed cannot govern. Something preserved but inaccessible can. This approach extends to human knowledge as well. Certain skills, rituals, and understandings were restricted to specific groups. Priesthoods did not merely transmit knowledge, they regulated it. Initiation was slow. Access was gradual. Some information was never passed on at all. It remained confined within institutions rather than lost. This confinement is often misunderstood as secrecy for secrecy's sake. But in context, it served a stabilizing function. Knowledge changes behavior. Behavior alters systems. Systems destabilize when altered too quickly. Confinement allowed societies to pace change without losing continuity. This principle is reflected in architecture. Libraries where they existed were often attached to temples or palaces. They were not public spaces, they were controlled environments. Tablets were stored in rooms that required authorization to enter. The knowledge was preserved meticulously, but access was limited. When texts describe divine instruction, they often emphasize what must not be shared. Forbidden knowledge is not forbidden because it is false. It is forbidden because its consequences cannot be managed easily. The punishment for transgression is rarely ignorance. It is containment. The transgressor is confined, bound, or removed from circulation. This pattern appears in myths of descent and imprisonment. Beings who acquire or misuse knowledge are not destroyed. They are placed somewhere they can no longer influence the surface world. The act of binding is emphasized repeatedly. Chains, seals, and enclosures appear far more often than weapons. The same logic governs how ancient societies treated physical objects associated with power. Dangerous tools were not smashed, they were buried. Weapons were deposited in ritual contexts. Objects of authority were placed in foundations. Once placed, they were not retrieved. Their presence stabilized the site. Their removal would have reintroduced risk. This approach is evident in foundation deposits. Objects placed beneath buildings were not offerings meant to be consumed or discarded. They were anchors, statements that something had been fixed in place. These deposits often included inscriptions naming gods, rulers, or intentions. Once buried, they no longer acted on the surface, but they continued to define it. The act of burial itself carried this meaning. Burial was not annihilation. The dead were not erased. They were relocated to a domain where they no longer interfered with the living. The underworld absorbed their presence. Memory remained, but activity ceased. This worldview challenges modern assumptions about progress. Today, knowledge is often treated as inherently beneficial. More information is assumed to lead to better outcomes. In the ancient world, knowledge was treated as a force that required management. More was not always better. Timing mattered. Context mattered. This caution is especially evident in flood narratives. The flood does not destroy all knowledge. Survivors carry seeds, skills, and memory forward. What is lost is excess, noise, overpopulation, instability. The flood functions as a reset mechanism that confines surplus rather than erasing civilization entirely. After the flood, certain capacities are deliberately limited. Human lifespans are shortened. Fertility is regulated. These measures do not eliminate humanity's potential. They confine it within manageable bounds. Knowledge remains, but its effects are tempered. The emphasis on confinement rather than destruction also explains why ancient texts are so careful about naming. Names carry power. To name something is to acknowledge it. To withhold a name is to limit its influence. Certain names are spoken only in ritual contexts, others are omitted entirely. The knowledge exists, but it is not activated. This restraint is mirrored in how stories end. Myths rarely resolve by eliminating a threat completely. They resolve by containing it. Monsters are bound, forces are sealed, chaos is pushed back beneath the surface. The world continues not because danger disappears, but because it is held in place. This containment logic extends to geography. Certain regions are marked as off-limits. Mountains, deserts, and deep waters are associated with confinement rather than exploration. These spaces are not conquered. They are acknowledged and avoided. When ancient builders encountered something they could not or would not remove, they covered it. They added weight. They built layers. Over time, the original object or space became unreachable, not because it was forgotten, but because it no longer needed to act. This process preserved knowledge in a dormant state. It could still exist as reference. It could still exert influence indirectly. But it could not disrupt daily life. This balance allowed societies to acknowledge complexity without being overwhelmed by it. The modern desire to uncover, reveal, and expose stands in tension with this ancient approach. Where modernity sees secrecy, the ancient world saw stewardship. Where modernity sees loss, the ancient world saw stability. Understanding this difference reframes how ancient silences are interpreted. Gaps in the record are not always the result of destruction. They're often the result of deliberate withholding. The knowledge was never meant to be part of public narrative. This withholding does not imply deception. It implies responsibility. The assumption was that not all knowledge was appropriate for all contexts. Wisdom lay not only in knowing, but in knowing when to stop. This principle governed law, religion, architecture, and social order. It provided a way to manage complexity over long periods. Systems could persist because they were not constantly challenged by unrestricted change. The monuments that remain today are physical expressions of this philosophy. They cover older spaces. They seal earlier decisions. They confine what once acted more freely. Their presence signals that something has been addressed and no longer requires intervention. The knowledge beneath them is not lost. It is contained. It continues to define the site even as surface meanings evolve. Later generations may reinterpret the structure, but the foundation holds the original decision in place. This containment also explains why ancient cultures placed such value on continuity. Traditions were passed down carefully. Innovations were integrated slowly. Sudden change was treated with suspicion. Stability was prized because it prevented the need to reopen sealed matters. In this context, destruction was a last resort. It created uncertainty. It erased reference points. Confinement preserved order while allowing life to continue. When ancient texts speak of knowledge that humans were not meant to possess, they do not suggest ignorance as an ideal. They suggest timing as a constraint. Knowledge introduced at the wrong moment could destabilize systems that had taken generations to balance. By confining such knowledge rather than destroying it, ancient societies left open the possibility of future access under different conditions. The knowledge was not gone, it was simply not active. This perspective transforms how buried chambers, sealed texts, and restricted spaces are understood. They are not failures of communication, they are expressions of intent. They represent decisions to preserve without circulate. That decision required confidence that stability mattered more than novelty. Confidence that the future would not need to revisit everything the past had already resolved. The fact that these decisions held for centuries suggests that the strategy worked. Civilizations endured, systems adapted gradually, boundaries remained intact. What modern observers often interpret as loss may instead be the residue of successful containment. The knowledge still exists, but it exists where it cannot disrupt. And in that sense, the silence beneath ancient monuments is not absence. It is presence held in reserve, fixed in place, doing nothing precisely because doing nothing was the goal. Stone was never chosen accidentally. In the ancient world, it was not merely a building material among others, it was a solution. When something needed to be fixed permanently, when movement itself became the problem to be solved, stone was the answer. Not because it was beautiful, and not even primarily because it was durable, but because of what it did through weight. Stone pressed down. Stone resisted change. Stone made reversal difficult enough to be functionally impossible. This distinction matters because concealment in ancient contexts was rarely about hiding something from view in a casual sense. It was about preventing interaction. Concealment was not achieved through secrecy alone, but through physical finality. If something could still be reached, it could still act. If it could still be acted upon, it remained a variable. Stone was used to remove variables from the system. The earliest monumental builders understood something that modern observers often overlook. True concealment does not rely on obscurity. It relies on effort. A thing is not truly concealed if it can be uncovered easily. It is concealed when the cost of access outweighs any conceivable benefit. Stone created that imbalance deliberately. This is why the larger stones were often placed where they seemed least necessary from a structural standpoint. Floors thicker than required. Foundations deeper than engineering alone would demand. Blocks far heavier than the load above justified. These were not inefficiencies, they were safeguards. The builders were not optimizing for convenience, they were optimizing for permanence. In Sumerian context, stone was rare and costly. Southern Mesopotamia lacked natural stone resources. Transporting stone required immense effort, yet when stone appears in foundations, it appears deliberately, strategically, and disproportionately. Its presence signals intent. When something beneath mattered enough, the cost was accepted. Weight served a dual purpose. Physically, it stabilized the ground, compressing soil, sealing cavities, and resisting upward pressure from water or voids. Symbolically, weight marked finality. What was buried under sufficient weight was no longer negotiable. It was not waiting to be rediscovered. It had been addressed. This logic becomes clearer when contrasted with materials chosen for other purposes. Mud brick, wood, and reed were perfectly adequate for walls, houses, and even large public buildings. These materials allowed for repair, alteration, and reuse. Stone did not. Stone was chosen where change was not desired. The combination of stone and depth amplified this effect. A chamber sealed shallowly might be reopened. A space buried deep beneath layered stone ceased to be part of practical reality. Over time, even memory of exact location could fade without compromising containment. The physical barrier remained effective regardless of knowledge. This is where impossibility enters the equation. Ancient concealment did not aim to make access unknown. It aimed to make access impractical. Even if one knew where something was, the effort required to reach it would disrupt everything above. The cost was not just labour. It was destabilization, collapse, flooding, irreversible damage. Impossibility does not require absolute prohibition, it requires disproportion. When the effort required becomes destructive, restraint becomes the rational choice. Ancient builders engineered this disproportion deliberately. They created situations where excavation would threaten the integrity of the entire structure, ensuring that future generations would hesitate. This hesitation was not accidental. It was part of the design. Stone was arranged not just to support but to threaten collapse if disturbed. Load paths were calculated intuitively. Removing one element would compromise many others. The structure taught restraint through risk. This principle is visible in pyramid construction. Internal chambers exist, but they are surrounded by massive stone buffers. Access corridors are narrow, angled, and limited. False passages mislead. Weight-bearing stones are positioned such that disturbance would cause catastrophic failure. These features are often described as security measures against tomb robbers, but their scale exceeds that explanation. A tomb robber seeks speed and opportunity. The level of over-engineering present suggests concern with something more enduring. Something that needed to remain inaccessible not just for years, but for millennia. Robbers come and go. Time is the real adversary. Stone resists time better than any other material. In Mesopotamia, where stone was scarce, weight was achieved through mass rather than material. Thick platforms of compacted earth and brick accumulated layer by layer. Each rebuild added pressure. The effect was the same. Over time, what lay beneath became unreachable, not because it was unknown, but because it was too deeply embedded in the city itself. The city became the seal. To reach what lay beneath, one would have to dismantle daily life. Homes, streets, temples, markets. The cost was social collapse. No rational actor would choose that path. The concealment was complete. This strategy reflects a long-term mindset that prioritized stability across generations. Ancient builders did not assume that their descendants would share their beliefs or values. They assumed only that future societies would prefer order over chaos. By tying access to destruction, they ensured compliance regardless of ideology. Stone also played a psychological role. Its presence communicated seriousness. A space sealed with light material might invite curiosity. A space sealed beneath hundreds of tons of stone communicated a different message. This is not meant to be opened. Even without written warnings, the material spoke. This communication was universal. Stone does not require language. Any culture encountering such construction would understand the implication. Weight equals importance. Weight equals finality. Weight equals warning. This universality explains why later cultures often respected ancient stone structures, even when they no longer understood their purpose. The material itself conveyed authority. Stone structures were treated differently from other ruins. They inspired caution rather than reuse. When stone was reused, it was often taken from visible portions, not from foundations. The deepest stones were left in place. The effort to remove them was not worth the risk. The seal held. The role of impossibility also clarifies why ancient builders sometimes chose locations that were already difficult to access. Building over cliffs, bedrock, or unstable terrain increased the cost of disturbance. Nature itself became part of the concealment strategy. Caves, fissures, and underground water sources were often covered rather than exploited. Stone structures placed above them prevented erosion, collapse, or intrusion. The natural feature remained, but its interaction with the surface world was regulated. This regulation mattered because ancient people did not see the world as static. They saw it as a balance that required maintenance. When boundaries weakened, consequences followed. Floods, subsidence, and disaster were reminders of what happened when containment failed. Stone was a preventative measure. It reduced the likelihood of boundary failure. It was an investment in long-term equilibrium. This perspective also explains why some ancient sites appear excessive in their construction. Why build something so massive when something smaller would suffice? Because sufficiency was not the goal. Irreversibility was. The builders were not concerned with immediate use. They were concerned with future behaviour. They were shaping not just space, but decision-making. They were ensuring that future generations would choose not to interfere, even if curiosity arose. This approach required confidence in human behaviour. It assumed that people would act rationally when faced with disproportionate cost. History suggests this assumption was largely correct. Many sealed spaces remained untouched for centuries despite knowledge of their existence. The use of stone also intersected with ritual. Foundation ceremonies often involved placing objects beneath stone layers. Once sealed, these objects could not be retrieved without removing the stone. Their presence reinforced the seal both physically and symbolically. The act of sealing was final. Ritual marked the moment when intervention ceased. After that point, maintenance replaced interaction. The structure existed to hold, not to reveal. This logic contrasts sharply with modern approaches to preservation and knowledge. Today, barriers are often temporary. Doors are meant to be opened. Locks are meant to be broken. Ancient seals were not designed to be challenged. They were designed to be accepted. Impossibility was not a flaw. It was the feature. This is why ancient concealment cannot be understood through the lens of secrecy alone. Secrets rely on ignorance. Ignorance fades. Concealment through weight relies on consequence. Consequence endures. Even when knowledge of what lay beneath survived in myth or rumour, action remained constrained. Knowing is not the same as reaching. Stone ensured that difference remained meaningful. This also explains why ancient texts rarely describe the contents of sealed spaces in detail. Description invites imagination. Imagination invites action. Silence reinforced restraint. The role of stone, weight, and impossibility was therefore not simply architectural, it was behavioural engineering. It shaped how people interacted with space, time, and memory. By making certain actions impractical, ancient builders removed the need for constant enforcement. The structure enforced itself. Gravity became law. This law did not require belief. It did not depend on fear of gods. It depended on recognition of reality. Remove this stone, and everything above collapses. That consequence required no myth. Over generations, this reality became normalized. People grew up surrounded by structures they would never question disturbing. The idea of digging beneath them felt wrong, not because it was forbidden, but because it was unthinkable. This unthinkability is the true measure of successful concealment. When an action does not even present itself as an option, the system is stable. Stone achieved that stability better than any decree or warning could. It translated intent into physical constraint, and once that translation was complete, the builders could step away. The structure would continue to do its work long after names were forgotten. The monument above might gather new meanings. It might become a shrine, a symbol, a landmark. But beneath it, the original purpose remained intact. Weight held, stone endured, impossibility persisted. This is why concealment in the ancient world was not about hiding from sight, but about removing choice. And stone, more than any other material, made that removal permanent. When the earliest texts speak about closure, they do so with a certainty that leaves little room for later intervention. The language does not suggest temporary sealing, postponement, or future recovery. It suggests finality. Certain actions, once completed, were not designed to be reversed. Certain spaces once closed were not meant to be opened again. This is not implied subtly. It is stated through repetition, structure, and silence. The Sumerian records use specific verbs when describing acts of sealing, binding, and fixing. These verbs are not used interchangeably with words for storage or concealment. They denote permanence. When something is fixed in the texts, it is no longer in flux. When a boundary is set, it is not provisional. The distinction matters because it reveals intent rather than circumstance. One of the clearest indicators of this intent is what the texts choose not to describe. When a space is sealed, the narrative moves on. There is no anticipation of reopening, no prophecy of future access, no heroic expectation that someone will one day return and undo the closure. The story treats the act as complete. Attention shifts elsewhere. This behaviour is consistent across mythological and administrative texts alike. When decrees are issued, they are described as irreversible. When judgments are passed, they are final. Appeals are rare and exceptional, requiring divine intervention rather than human effort. Even then, reversals come at cost. Substitution is required. Balance must be restored. Nothing simply resumes as it was before. The underworld itself embodies this principle. Entry is possible under certain conditions, but exit is not guaranteed. What passes fully into that domain is no longer part of the surface narrative. This is why descent myths carry such weight. They mark a transition that alters status permanently. The warning is implicit. Some thresholds are crossed only once. This understanding extends to physical spaces. When texts reference chambers, foundations, or sealed places, they do so without providing instructions for reopening. There are no rituals described for safely undoing a seal. There are rituals for placing one. The asymmetry is telling. The act of closure is supported. The act of reopening is not. This omission is not accidental. Ancient texts were precise when precision mattered. They included procedural details where action was expected. Their silence on reopening reflects a shared assumption that reopening was not part of the system. The closure resolved something. Revisiting it would reintroduce instability. This logic appears clearly in flood narratives. After the flood recedes, the boundary between worlds is re-established. The waters are confined again. Promises are made that this particular intervention will not be repeated in the same way. The emphasis is not on the flood itself, but on the restoration of containment afterward. Once restored, the boundary is not meant to be tested again. The texts describe measures taken to ensure this stability. Lifespans are reduced. Population growth is regulated. Human activity is constrained. These changes are not temporary. They redefine the conditions of life permanently. The system moves forward, not backward. This forward-only movement is a recurring theme. Creation itself is not cyclical in the earliest texts. It is sequential. Once separation occurs, it is not undone. Heaven does not collapse back into earth. The waters do not reclaim the surface permanently. boundaries once established are maintained. When disruptions occur, they are treated as failures of maintenance rather than invitations to revisit earlier states. The solution is reinforcement, not reversal. More weight is added, more structure is built, more regulation is imposed. This perspective helps explain why ancient texts often frame reopening as transgression. When beings attempt to cross boundaries without authorization, the result is punishment rather than discovery. The act itself is condemned, not the motive. Curiosity does not excuse violation. The mythological language used to describe such violations emphasizes consequence. Those who attempt to reopen sealed domains lose status, freedom, or life. The narrative does not reward the attempt with knowledge. It reinforces the boundary by demonstrating its cost. This narrative pattern served a practical function. It discouraged behavior that could destabilize society. By framing reopening as dangerous rather than heroic, the text guided collective restraint. The stories were not meant to inspire exploration. They were meant to maintain order. This restraint is reflected in how later generations treated inherited sites. Even when the original purpose of a seal was forgotten, the behavior persisted. Sites remained undisturbed. Excavation was avoided. New construction reinforced old boundaries rather than challenging them. The texts suggest that once something was sealed, it no longer required explanation. Explanation would invite reconsideration. Silence preserved finality. The absence of instruction became its own instruction. This approach also explains why ancient records often emphasize the moment of sealing more than what is sealed. The act itself is the focal point. The content is secondary. What mattered was that the decision had been made and enacted. In administrative context, this principle appears in contracts and legal agreements. Once a contract is sealed, it is binding. The seal is more important than the content because it marks the transition from negotiation to obligation. Breaking the seal invalidates the order it represents. The same logic applies at a cosmic level. When boundaries between realms are sealed, the cosmos stabilizes. When seals fail, chaos returns. The act of sealing is therefore central to maintaining existence itself. This framing also clarifies why ancient texts resist reinterpretation of sealed events. Later generations may retell stories, but they rarely alter outcomes. The flood remains destructive. The descent remains costly. The judgment remains final. The story can be embellished, but the closure is not undone. The reluctance to reopen sealed matters is also evident in how ancient cultures treated ancestral decisions. Foundational laws, rituals, and boundaries were treated as givens. Reform occurred gradually and cautiously. Radical change was suspect. This caution reflects an understanding that some decisions create dependencies that cannot be easily unravelled. Once a foundation is laid, everything above depends on it. Reopening the foundation risks collapse. The texts implicitly acknowledge this risk by avoiding language that suggests future access. They do not promise that sealed spaces will one day be revealed. They do not hint at hidden rewards awaiting discovery. They present closure as resolution, not delay. This stands in contrast to later mythological traditions that frame hidden knowledge as something to be recovered. In the earliest records, recovery is not the goal. Stability is. This emphasis on stability over revelation also aligns with how ancient societies valued continuity. Survival depended on predictability. Floods, famine, and conflict were constant threats. Systems that worked were preserved, not questioned unnecessarily. The decision to seal something permanently was therefore a rational response to perceived risk. It was a way to remove a variable from an already unstable environment. Once removed, the system could be managed more effectively. The texts reflect confidence in this strategy. They do not express regret or doubt about sealing actions. There is no nostalgia for what was closed. The narrative moves forward, accepting the new conditions as normal. This acceptance is important. It signals that closure was not seen as loss, but as necessary adjustment. Something had to be given up to preserve something else. This trade-off is explicit in some myths. Life is preserved at the cost of immortality. Order is preserved at the cost of freedom. Stability is preserved at the cost of access. These are not tragedies. They are conditions of existence. The absence of reopening rituals further reinforces this view. If reopening were anticipated, procedures would exist. Their absence suggests that reopening was not considered a legitimate option. This does not mean that ancient people lacked imagination. It means they exercised restraint. They understood that not every possibility should be pursued. The text suggests that once a space, object, or knowledge was sealed, its role changed. It no longer acted directly. It became a reference point. Its influence was indirect, shaping behavior through absence rather than presence. This indirect influence was sufficient. The system held. The boundary worked. There was no need to revisit the sealed matter. Understanding this helps explain why ancient monuments often appear silent about their deepest layers. The silence is intentional. It marks completion. What lies beneath does not need to speak. It has already been addressed. The act of sealing was the final word. This finality does not depend on belief. It depends on acceptance. Once a community accepts that a matter is closed, it becomes so in practice. The texts reinforce this acceptance by modelling it. They do not dwell on sealed spaces. They do not invite speculation. They treat closure as settled fact. This modelling shaped cultural behaviour. People learned not to ask certain questions, not to dig in certain places, not to challenge certain boundaries. These limits were not enforced constantly. They were internalised. Over time, the sealed matters became part of the background of existence. They shaped the world without requiring attention. Their success lay in their invisibility. The idea that something was never meant to be reopened is therefore not speculative. It is supported by textual behaviour. The way the texts move on, the way they avoid procedural detail, the way they frame reopening as violation all point in the same direction. Closure was not provisional. It was definitive. This understanding reframes modern expectations. The assumption that hidden things exist to be found conflicts with an ancient assumption that some things exist to remain closed. The difference is not about fear or ignorance. It is about priorities. Ancient priorities favoured continuity over discovery. They valued a world that could endure more than a world that could explain everything. The sealed spaces beneath monuments reflect that value. They are not puzzles waiting for solutions. They are decisions that have already been made. The text suggests that reopening them would not complete a story. It would undo one, and so they remain closed, not because they were forgotten, but because they were finished. Once construction is complete in the ancient records, something notable happens. The language thins, the detail fades. The texts that were once precise about measurement, placement, and procedure begin to fall quiet. This silence is not accidental, and it is not the result of lost tablets alone. It follows a pattern that appears too consistently to be dismissed as chance. After the work is finished, the records move on. In earlier phases, texts are meticulous. They describe the preparation of the ground, the laying of foundations, the materials chosen, the rituals performed, and the authority under which the work proceeds. Names are recorded, dates are fixed, actions are specified. But once the structure stands and the foundation is sealed, the narrative attention shifts elsewhere. The site remains, but it is no longer explained. This silence does not indicate disinterest. It indicates resolution. The matter has been addressed. There is nothing left to negotiate. In administrative terms, the file is closed. In Mesopotamian building inscriptions, kings often emphasize the act of founding more than the act of using. They describe how a temple was established, how its base was secured, how its corners were fixed. They may list the gods invoked during construction, but they rarely describe what happens beneath the structure afterward. The foundation disappears from the narrative once it is complete. This pattern contrasts sharply with texts about ongoing activities. Irrigation systems are described repeatedly. Canals require maintenance and regulation. Laws are amended, clarified, and reissued. Military campaigns are recorded in detail. These are active systems that require constant attention. Foundations do not. Once sealed, they do their work without intervention. The absence of commentary after construction suggests that reopening was not expected. If future interaction were anticipated, instructions would exist. Maintenance procedures would be outlined. Access protocols would be preserved. Instead, the texts assume permanence. The structure is there, the ground is stabilized. The narrative moves forward. This behavior aligns with how ancient societies treated other irreversible acts. When a treaty was signed and sealed, the negotiation phase ended. The text recorded the agreement, not the debates that followed. Silence signaled that the terms were now binding. Continued discussion would imply uncertainty. The same logic applies to monumental construction. The act of building over a site was itself a decision. Once executed, it no longer required explanation. To explain it repeatedly would invite reconsideration. Silence preserved authority. This silence is particularly striking when compared to later mythological elaborations. Later traditions often add stories, symbolism, and interpretation to ancient sites. But these layers come from periods removed from the original construction. The earliest records do not indulge in such elaboration. They state the fact of building and then proceed to other matters. The contrast suggests that the builders themselves did not view the structure as a subject for ongoing narrative. It was infrastructure. Once in place, it became part of the background of life. Infrastructure does not require storytelling. It requires trust. Archaeological layers reinforce this interpretation. Beneath monuments, earlier levels show intense activity. Preparation, adjustment, experimentation. Above the foundation, layers show occupation, ritual and reuse. But at the moment of sealing, activity narrows. The space beneath becomes inert. It no longer participates in daily life. This inertness is mirrored in the texts. The absence of mention is not ignorance. It is acknowledgement that the space has transitioned from active to fixed. What is fixed does not need description. This silence also protects meaning. Words can be reinterpreted, instructions can be misunderstood. Silence reduces the risk of misuse. By not providing guidance on reopening or alteration, the texts limit future action. This restraint is especially evident in cases where later builders encountered earlier foundations. The texts rarely record these encounters in detail. They do not celebrate discovery. They do not describe exploration. Instead, they note reinforcement, repair, continuation. The earlier foundation is treated as given. The lack of curiosity in the record is revealing. Modern narratives prize discovery. Ancient narratives prized stability. Once something was known to exist and had been addressed appropriately, there was no incentive to revisit it. This perspective also explains why certain monumental sites appear archaeologically mute despite their scale. They dominate the landscape, yet leave few explanatory texts. The silence is proportional to their perceived permanence. The more fixed the structure, the less it needed explanation. In some cases, the only references to a structure appear at the moment of its founding, and then centuries later when it is repaired or rebuilt. The intervening silence suggests that nothing needed to be said. The structure functioned as intended. This silence is not universal. It applies selectively to certain types of construction. Palaces generate ongoing records. Storehouses are inventoried. Temples associated with active ritual receive periodic mention. But the deepest, most foundational aspects remain unspoken. This selectivity indicates intention. The silence is not a gap in literacy. It is a choice about what deserves ongoing attention. The choice reflects an understanding that certain actions resolve issues permanently. Once resolved, they should not be reopened rhetorically or physically. Doing so would undermine confidence in the resolution. The texts model this behaviour. By moving on, they demonstrate trust in the decision that was made. They do not second guess. They do not revisit. They do not warn repeatedly. The absence of warning suggests that warning was no longer necessary. This modelling would have shaped cultural behaviour. If the texts do not speak about reopening, people are less likely to consider it. If the records treat the matter as settled, the community follows suit. Over generations, this silence becomes normalised. The site is known, respected, and avoided where necessary. No one expects new information to emerge from beneath it. The question is not asked. This normalisation is one of the most effective forms of control. It does not rely on fear or enforcement. It relies on acceptance. The boundary is internalised. The silence also protects against reinterpretation. As long as the texts do not speculate, later readers have less material to work with. The site resists narrative appropriation. It remains what it is. When later cultures do reinterpret such sites, they do so from the outside. They project new meanings onto the visible structure. The sealed foundation remains untouched by these stories. Its function is unaffected. This separation between surface meaning and foundational function is crucial. It allows culture to evolve without destabilizing the underlying decision. The monument can become a shrine, a symbol, or a landmark. The seal remains. The silence in the record supports this separation. By not tying the foundation too tightly to a specific story, the builders ensured that the structure could endure through cultural change. This endurance is visible today. Many ancient sites have been reinterpreted dozens of times. Religions have changed. Languages have vanished. Yet the ground beneath remains protected. The original builders did not need to predict these changes. They only needed to ensure that their decision would not depend on continued belief. Silence accomplished that. Silence also prevents escalation. Detailed explanation invites challenge. Ambiguity invites debate. Silence closes the door gently but firmly. This approach contrasts with later traditions that seek to persuade or instruct explicitly. The earliest records assume compliance. They do not argue for it. The assumption appears to have been justified. The sites remained undisturbed for long periods. Even when disturbed, the disturbance often came from reuse rather than excavation. The silence also complicates modern interpretation. Researchers expect explanation. When they do not find it, they assume loss. But the pattern suggests something else. The explanation was never meant to extend beyond the moment of construction. The builders recorded what mattered when it mattered. After that, they trusted the structure itself to communicate intent. Stone communicates permanence better than words. Weight communicates finality more clearly than instruction. Silence reinforces both. The absence of post-construction commentary is therefore not a weakness in the record. It is part of the system. The record does not fail to speak. It chooses not to. This choice aligns with everything else observed. The emphasis on depth, the preference for sealing, the use of weight, the avoidance of reopening, all point toward a worldview that valued closure over continued engagement. Once the structure stood, the problem it addressed was no longer active. There was no reason to keep discussing it. Discussion would imply instability. The silence says, without words, that the matter is settled. And because it is settled, the narrative moves on, leaving the structure to do its work quietly, beneath layers of time while life continues above. When later cultures encountered the great monuments of the ancient world, they did not encounter them as their builders had. They arrived after the decisions had already been made, after foundations had been sealed, after the original reasoning had been rendered unnecessary by success. What they inherited was not intent, but outcome. Stone remained. Weight remained. The purpose that required those things no longer needed to announce itself. This gap between structure and understanding is not a failure of transmission. It is the natural result of a system designed to outlast explanation. The earliest builders did not rely on continued belief or precise memory to preserve what mattered. They relied on physical reality. As long as the structure remained intact, its function held, regardless of how it was interpreted. Later cultures therefore interacted with these sites differently. They saw monuments as given facts of the landscape, not as responses to specific conditions. The ground was already marked. The stone was already in place. Whatever had required sealing had been sealed. There was no practical reason to revisit the original purpose, and often no surviving explanation that demanded attention. Human societies are adaptive. When they inherit something whose function is no longer obvious, they reinterpret it in terms that make sense within their own worldview. A structure built as a seal becomes a shrine. A platform designed for stabilization becomes a symbol of divine presence. A boundary becomes a center. This process does not negate the original purpose, it simply overlays it. The physical constraints imposed by the structure ensure that reinterpretation remains superficial. New meanings attach to what is visible. Rituals develop around accessible spaces. Myths grow around the exterior. But the deepest layers remain untouched, continuing to perform their original role without interference. This is why later cultures could radically change the story of a site without altering its behavior. They worshipped different gods. They told new myths. They performed new rituals. Yet they still avoided disturbing the foundations. The avoidance persisted even when the reason for it was no longer articulated. In many cases, later builders explicitly acknowledged their distance from the original purpose. Inscriptions sometimes state that a site was ancient even in their own time. They speak of restoring rather than creating. They emphasize continuity, not innovation. This language reflects an understanding that the site carried authority independent of current belief. The authority of the site came from its endurance. Something that had lasted through previous ages was treated with respect by default. Longevity itself became a justification. If a structure had stood unchanged for centuries, it was assumed to be correct. Questioning it would imply arrogance rather than curiosity. This assumption was reinforced by the physical difficulty of alteration. Even if someone wished to uncover what lay beneath, doing so would require dismantling what now supported daily life. Cities had grown around these sites, economies depended on them. Religious calendars were anchored to them. Disturbance would have cascading effects. Later cultures therefore inherited a situation where the cost of inquiry was far higher than the benefit. The original builders had anticipated this. By embedding the seal within the fabric of society, they ensured that curiosity would be outweighed by responsibility. As time passed, memory shifted from explanation to tradition. People knew that certain places were important, dangerous, or untouchable, but they no longer knew why. The why was not needed, the rule was enough. This pattern appears repeatedly in the archaeological record. A site begins with a narrow, specific function. Over time, that function is absorbed into broader cultural meaning. Eventually, the site becomes symbolic rather than operational. Yet its operational effect continues unnoticed. The shift from purpose to symbol is gradual. It does not happen all at once. Early generations may retain partial understanding. Later ones retain only reverence. Eventually, reverence itself becomes habit. This process is visible in how rituals change. Early rituals often involve maintenance, measurement, and restraint. Later rituals emphasize celebration, narrative, and identity. The focus moves upward and outward. The ground beneath becomes abstracted. Yet even as rituals become more expressive, certain limits remain. Areas remain restricted. Excavation remains taboo. The foundation is still treated differently from the rest of the structure. This selective preservation indicates that while meaning changed, behavior did not entirely. The inherited structure continued to guide action even as belief evolved. Later cultures also tended to align new meanings with visible features rather than invisible ones. Towers, facades, and alignments attracted interpretation. Foundations did not. This bias reinforced the separation between surface narrative and subsurface function. The result is a layered site where multiple purposes coexist without conflict. The original purpose operates silently. Later purposes operate publicly. Each serves a different need. This coexistence explains why ancient sites could be reused so effectively. They did not require complete understanding to remain functional. The seal did not require belief. It required only that it not be disturbed. In some cases, later cultures even intensified the original function unknowingly. By adding new structures, expanding platforms, or reinforcing walls, they increased weight and permanence. What began as a single act of sealing became a compounded one. This reinforcement often occurred without awareness of its effect. Builders sought grandeur, legitimacy, or continuity. They achieved those goals while simultaneously strengthening the original containment. This is why many of the heaviest, most complex monuments are the result of multiple cultural phases rather than a single moment. Each phase added its own meaning and mass. The site grew more stable with each reinterpretation. The original purpose was not lost because it was fragile. It was lost because it no longer needed explanation. It succeeded so thoroughly that it became invisible. In contrast, purposes that require constant justification tend to leave extensive records. Laws are debated, doctrines are defended, practices are explained. The absence of such debate around sealed sites suggests that they were not contested. Later cultures did not argue about whether to reopen these places. The question did not arise. The inherited structure framed the issue as settled. This framing also protected later societies from the responsibility of decision. They did not have to choose whether to disturb the site. The choice had already been made. Their role was to maintain, not to judge. This transfer of responsibility across generations is a hallmark of durable systems. It allows continuity without requiring consensus. People can disagree about meaning while still agreeing on behavior. The monuments facilitated this by being physically unambiguous. They stood, they weighed, they resisted change. Interpretation could vary. Stone did not. As a result, later cultures could safely forget the original purpose without undermining its effect. Forgetting did not equal failure. It was part of the design. The idea that later cultures misunderstood ancient monuments assumes that understanding was required. In reality, compliance was sufficient. As long as the structure remained intact, the system worked. This perspective reframes the relationship between ancient builders and their successors. It was not a failure of communication. It was a deliberate handoff. The builders trusted physical reality to carry their decision forward. Later cultures inherited the structures because they could not avoid them. They did not inherit the purpose because they did not need to. The structure did not ask for interpretation. It demanded accommodation. Over time, accommodation became tradition. Tradition became identity. Identity attached new stories to old stone. Those stories may tell us much about the later cultures who told them. They tell us less about the original builders, whose priorities lay elsewhere. The original builders did not seek to be understood. They sought to be effective. Their success made explanation redundant. This is why ancient sites often feel older than the myths associated with them. The stone precedes the story. The foundation precedes belief. What later cultures inherited was a finished action. They lived above it, around it, and within it without needing to know why it had been done. The structure held. That was enough. And because it was enough, the purpose could remain buried, intact, doing its work quietly while generations passed overhead. interpreting the monument anew, unaware that the most important function required no interpretation at all. When meaning fades but stone remains, something subtle yet powerful happens. The structure continues to exist, but the reason for its existence withdraws from language. What is left is not emptiness, but opacity. The monument stands, intact and unquestioned, while the explanation that once justified it dissolves into habit, ritual, or myth. This condition is not accidental. It is the natural outcome of a system designed to function without constant understanding. Stone endures because it does not require interpretation to perform its role. Weight does not ask to be believed. A sealed foundation does not depend on memory. Even when every story attached to a structure has changed, the physical fact of the structure continues to shape behavior. People walk around it, build beside it, avoid digging beneath it. The action persists even when the reason is no longer spoken. What remains hidden in this process is not simply an object or a chamber. What remains hidden is intent. The original decision that prompted the act of sealing is no longer available to be debated, revised, or misunderstood. It has been converted into matter. Stone becomes the archive. Weight becomes the instruction. This conversion is one of the most effective ways to preserve a decision across time. Words degrade, languages change, symbols shift. Stone resists all of this. It does not explain itself, but it does not need to. Its presence constrains action more reliably than explanation ever could. When meaning is lost, humans do not behave randomly. They adapt by assigning new meanings that fit their current worldview. A sealed space becomes sacred. A boundary becomes a center. A stabilizing structure becomes a place of identity. These reinterpretations are not errors. They are survival strategies. They allow communities to live with inherited conditions without needing to resolve questions that no longer have practical relevance. Yet beneath these new meanings, the original condition persists. The space remains sealed. The depth remains undisturbed. The ground continues to be treated as exceptional. The behavior that mattered most is preserved even as the story changes. This preservation is especially evident at sites that have accumulated multiple layers of cultural meaning. A location that begins as a sealed space becomes a temple. The temple becomes a shrine. The shrine becomes a monument. The monument becomes a symbol of national or spiritual identity. At each stage, new narratives attach themselves to the visible structure. At no stage is the foundation reopened. The endurance of stone ensures that reinterpretation cannot easily override physical constraint. Even if a later culture wished to redefine the site completely, it would still have to contend with the material reality beneath it. The cost of disturbance remains disproportionate. The seal holds. What remains hidden, then, is not simply buried content. It is the original boundary between what was permitted and what was not. That boundary continues to operate without needing to be articulated. People sense it rather than understand it. This sensing often manifests as unease. Certain places feel inappropriate to disturb. Certain actions feel wrong without clear justification. This feeling is not superstition. It is inherited behavior responding to inherited structure. Stone plays a crucial role in sustaining this inheritance. Unlike wood or earth, stone does not blend back into the landscape easily. It asserts itself across generations. It forces accommodation. Even when its meaning is unclear, its presence is undeniable. This denial of easy erasure is what keeps the hidden hidden. If a structure could be dismantled casually, curiosity might prevail. If access was simple, exploration would follow. Stone ensures neither condition applies. Over time, the hidden becomes normalized. People grow up with the monument as part of their environment. It is no longer questioned. It simply is. The original decision has succeeded so completely that it no longer registers as a decision at all. This success creates a paradox. The The better the system works, the less visible its purpose becomes. Stability erases the memory of instability. Containment erases the memory of threat. What remains is form without explanation. This form invites myth, art, and speculation, but these operate at the surface level. They do not penetrate the foundation. The hidden remains hidden not because it is guarded actively, but because nothing compels access. Even when technologies emerge that could, in theory, allow deeper excavation, restraint often persists. Legal protection, religious tradition, and cultural caution converge. The stone is defended by institutions rather than myths. This institutional protection is another layer of the same logic. The original builders relied on weight. Later societies rely on law. Both serve the same function. Both preserve closure. What is most revealing is that this preservation does not require consensus. People may disagree about what a monument means, but they still agree not to disturb it. Meaning is negotiable, behaviour is not. This separation allows societies to evolve without destabilising inherited structures. New beliefs can flourish above ground while the foundation remains untouched. Change occurs where it is safe. Stability remains where it is necessary. The hidden, in this context, is not waiting to be discovered. It is waiting to remain hidden. Its success is measured by how little it intrudes into daily life. When meaning is lost, curiosity often turns inward rather than downward. People ask what a monument symbolises rather than what it conceals. This redirection protects the seal. Stone endures as a kind of silent authority. It does not argue, it does not persuade, it simply persists. Its persistence shapes choices long after explanations have faded. This shaping effect explains why some ancient sites feel resistant to reinterpretations, despite constant scholarly attention. The surface can be debated endlessly. The foundation remains inaccessible. The hidden also benefits from ambiguity. Without a clear explanation, there is no clear reason to act. Action requires motivation. Ambiguity diffuses it. This diffusion is another form of containment. When no single narrative dominates, none compels disturbance. The safest option becomes inaction. Over generations, inaction becomes tradition. Tradition becomes respect. Respect becomes protection. This chain of effects allows the hidden to remain hidden even in societies that value discovery. The cost of breaking tradition appears higher than the benefit of revelation. Stone supports this calculation by making revelation physically costly. The monument does not yield easily. It resists effort. It threatens consequence. This threat does not need to be explicit. It is implied by scale, weight, and integration into the surrounding environment. To disturb the monument would disturb much more than stone. Thus, what remains hidden is preserved not by secrecy, but by integration. The hidden is woven into the structure of life so thoroughly that extracting it would unravel too much. The loss of meaning does not weaken this system, it strengthens it. Without a clear story to challenge, the structure stands uncontested. This outcome reflects the priorities of the original builders. They did not need future generations to remember why the seal existed. They needed future generations not to break it. Stone ensures that this requirement is met even when memory fails. What remains hidden, then, is not a relic awaiting rediscovery. It is a resolved matter. Its influence persists precisely because it does not demand attention. The monument above it absorbs attention instead. People look up, not down. They celebrate what they can see. They speculate about symbolism. The hidden remains undisturbed. This division of attention is not accidental. It is structural. The visible distracts from the invisible. The impressive obscures the consequential. Stone makes this distraction permanent. It channels curiosity away from depth and towards surface. In this way, endurance replaces explanation. Stability replaces narrative. The hidden remains hidden not because it is unknown, but because it no longer needs to be known. The stone has taken over the work of memory. It holds the decision in place, long after the words that once explained it have fallen silent. And as long as the stone endures, so does the hidden, intact, unchallenged, continuing to shape the world above it without ever needing to reveal itself again. As the night settles and the world grows quieter, there is a particular kind of stillness that invites reflection without demanding answers. The kind that does not push forward, but simply allows thoughts to rest where they fall. When the ancient world chose to bury something beneath stone, beneath weight, beneath generations of rebuilding, it was not acting in haste or fear. It was acting with deliberation, patience, and an understanding of time that extended far beyond a single life. Burial, in its oldest sense, was not erasure. It was placement. It was the act of assigning something a location where it could no longer interfere, but where it could still exist. The ancient builders did not treat burial as loss. They treated it as resolution. Once something was placed beneath the earth and sealed with enough weight to resist return, the matter was considered settled. This perspective reframes the silence that followed. The lack of instruction, the absence of reopening rituals, the gradual fading of explanation were not oversights. They were signs of confidence. Confidence that the solution would endure without supervision. Confidence that future generations would not need to understand the original problem in order to live safely above it. Stone made that confidence possible. Weight replaced warning. Impossibility replaced enforcement. The system no longer depended on belief, memory, or agreement. It depended on gravity and restraint. As long as the stone remained, the decision remained in effect. Over time, meaning shifted. New cultures arrived. New stories formed. The surface of the world changed its language and its symbols. Yet beneath those changes, the buried remained undisturbed. Not because it was forgotten, but because it no longer demanded attention. Its influence had become indirect, shaping behaviour through absence rather than presence. The monuments above became objects of admiration, identity, and reverence. People gathered, celebrated, and speculated. They looked upward, tracing outlines against the sky. Rarely did they feel compelled to look downward with the same intensity. The visible absorbed curiosity. The hidden was allowed to remain still. This arrangement was not accidental. It was the outcome the builders had engineered. By giving future generations something impressive to look at, they reduced the likelihood that those generations would feel the need to look beneath. The monument became a focal point, a narrative surface that carried attention away from depth. What lay buried continued to perform its function quietly. It did not act. It did not speak. It did not need to. Its role was complete. Stability had replaced activity. Containment had replaced negotiation. In this sense, the buried was not waiting. It was resting. Resting in a state that required no further intervention. The world above could change endlessly without disturbing it. That was the measure of success. The ancient builders understood something subtle about time. They understood that explanations decay faster than structures, and that decisions encoded in matter last longer than those encoded in words. By transferring intent into stone, they ensured that even misunderstanding would not undo their work. Later generations did not inherit the urgency that once surrounded these sites. They inherited the calm, a calm born of problems already addressed. That calm allowed life to continue without constant vigilance. The buried remained because it was no longer part of an active story. It had become part of the world's foundation. Foundations do not ask to be revisited. They ask to be trusted. Trust was easier than the inquiry. Inquiry would have required dismantling what had grown above. Homes, rituals, identities, and histories had accumulated around these places. Disturbance would have meant loss far greater than any knowledge gained. So the buried stayed where it was. not because it was feared, but because it was finished. As centuries passed, this finish became invisible. People forgot that a decision had ever been made. They experienced only the outcome. The ground felt solid, the structure endured, nothing demanded correction. This is how stability feels. It does not announce itself. It fades into the background, becoming the default condition of existence. The quiet that surrounds ancient monuments at night carries this quality, a sense that something has already been resolved, that nothing beneath needs attention now, that the weight above is doing its work. Stone does not hurry. It does not age in human time. It allows generations to pass without comment. Its silence is not emptiness. It is assurance. What was buried was placed there with intention, sealed with care, and left to remain precisely because remaining was the point. The absence of disturbance is not a failure to uncover. It is the continuation of a choice made long ago. As the mind slows and attention softens, there is no need to reach for answers. The ancient world did not leave every question open. Some matters were closed so that others could proceed. Life above ground needed space to grow, to change, to forget, and to remember new things. The buried made that possible by staying still, and so, beneath monuments that catch the light of day and the shadows of night, something remains exactly as it was meant to be. Not hidden in anticipation, not waiting to be revealed, but settled. The world above moves on because the world below does not, and in that balance there is a kind of quiet that does not require explanation, only acceptance, allowing rest to come naturally, carried by the weight of stone and the certainty of decisions that no longer need to be spoken.